Good morning. I now convene this morning's hearing entitled, "Where Have All the Patients Gone?" Examining the Psychiatric Bed Shortage. Right after the December 14th, 2012 elementary school shooting in Newtown, Connecticut, the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations began a review of federal programs and resources devoted to mental health and serious mental illness. Recent events have shown the continuing importance of this inquiry, including the September 2013 Navy Yard shooting just a couple of miles from where we sit this morning in Washington, D.C. Other tragic cases like Sang-Hui Cho, James Holmes, Jared Lochner, and Adam Lanza all exhibited a record of untreated, severe mental illness prior to their crimes. It is a reflection of the total dysfunction of our current mental health system that despite clear warning signs, these individuals failed to receive inpatient or outpatient treatment for their illnesses that might have averted these tragedies. And they all leave us wondering, what would have happened if? What would have happened if Aaron Alexis was not just given sleeping pills at the VA hospitals? Or if there was an available hospital bed or outpatient treatment available for others who later became violent, involved in a crime, unable to pay their bills, or tossed out on the street? Part of the problem is that our laws on involuntary commitment are in dire need of modernization. It is simply unreasonable, if not a danger to public safety, that our current system often waits until an individual is on the brink of harming himself or others, or has already done so, before any action can be taken. The scarcity of effective inpatient or outpatient treatment options in the community, as illustrated by the premature release of Gus Deeds, son of Virginia Senator Creed Deeds, from emergency custody because of the lack of psychiatric hospital beds, is also to blame. And it is a sad, sad ending. In our heart, we cannot begin to imagine a parent's grief when told there is no place for your son or daughter to get help. Nationwide, we face an alarming shortage in inpatient psychiatric beds that, if not addressed, will result in more tragic outcomes. This is part of the long-term legacy of deinstitutionalization, the emptying out of state psychiatric hospitals resulting from the financial burden for community-based care being shifted from the state to the federal government. With deinstitutionalization, the number of available inpatient psychiatric beds has fallen considerably. The number of beds has decreased in the 1950s from 559,000 to just 43,000 today. Back in the 1950s, half of every hospital bed was a psychiatric bed. We needed to close those old hospitals that had become asylums, lockups, and quite frankly, they were dumping grounds. But where did all the patients go? They were supposed to be in community treatment. They were supposed to be on the road to recovery. But for many, that simply did not happen. The result is that individuals with serious mental illness who are unable to obtain treatment through ordinary means are in too many cases homeless or entangled in the criminal justice system, including being locked up in jails or prisons. Right now, the country's three largest jail systems in Cook County, Illinois, Los Angeles County, and New York City have more than 11,000 prisoners receiving treatment on any given day and are, in fact, the largest mental health treatment facilities in the country. These jails are many times larger than the largest state psychiatric hospitals. Not surprisingly, neither living on the street nor being confined to a high-security cell block are known to improve the chances that an individual's serious mental illness will stabilize, let alone prepare them where possible for eventual recovery into the community, to find housing, to find jobs, and to find confidence in their future. It is an unplanned, albeit entirely unacceptable consequence of deinstitutionalization that the state psychiatric asylums, dismantled out of concern for the humane treatment and care of individuals with serious mental illness, have now effectively been replaced by confinement in prisons and homeless shelters and tied to hospital beds. What can we do earlier in people's lives to get them evidence-based treatment, community support, and on the road to recovery, not the road to recidivism? Where is the humanity in saying there are no beds to treat a person suffering from acute schizophrenia, delusions, agitation, and aggression, and so that what they're offered is sedation and being restrained in an ER hospital bed for days? This morning, to provide some perspective on the far-reaching implications of the current psychiatric bed shortage and to hear some creative approaches to address it, we'll be receiving testimony from individuals with a wealth of experience across the full range of public services consumed by the seriously mentally ill across our nation. These include Lisa Ashley, the mother of a son with serious mental illness who has been boarded multiple times at the emergency department, Dr. Jeffrey Geller, a psychiatrist and co-author of a report on the trends and consequences of closing public psychiatric hospitals. Dr. John Mark Hon, an ER physician and task force chair in a recent study of the emergency care compiled by the American College of Emergency Physicians. Chief Mike Basadi, immediate past president of the New York State Association of Chiefs of Police and parent of a daughter with serious mental illness. Sheriff Tom Dart of Cook County, Illinois, Sheriff's Office, who oversees one of the largest single-site county pre-detention facilities in the United States. The Honorable Steve Leifman, Associate Administrative Judge, Miami-Dade County Court, 11th Judicial Court of Florida. Gunther Stern, Executive Director of Georgetown Ministry Center, a shelter and clubhouse caring for the Washington, D.C. homeless. Hakeem Rahee, a mental health educator and advocate. Lamar Ederson, a clinical mental health counselor and Director at Large of the American Mental Health Counselors Association. And Dr. Arthur Evans, Jr., Commissioner of Philadelphia's Department of Behavioral Health and Intellectual Disability Services. I thank you all for being with us this morning and giving us so much of your time. And I'd like to give the ranking member an opportunity to deliver brief remarks on her own. Ms. DeGette.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for having this hearing and also for your continued leadership on the important topic of mental health. I want to thank all of the witnesses for appearing before us today. I think this sets a record as the biggest panel we've ever had in this subcommittee, and I'm looking forward to hearing each one of your perspectives. It's rare we ever get so much knowledge and such a breadth gathered in one place. Mr. Rahim, I'm especially glad that you're here with us this morning. This is our fourth hearing in this subcommittee on mental health during this Congress, but this is the first time we've ever heard directly from somebody who can share his own personal history with mental illness and sit before us as a testament to the possibility of recovery. I know it takes a lot of courage to tell these personal stories in public, and I want to commend you for being here. I also want to commend Ms. Ashley, Mr. Basadi, for being here today as parents, because I've been approached by so many parents in my district who know that I'm working on these issues, talking to me about the heartbreak of having young adults or teenagers who are dealing with these issues and what it's like as a family member. All of you can add really good perspective to this, and I want to thank you. The question for this hearing, where have all the patients gone, is a very important one. Individuals with serious mental illnesses like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia are showing up in emergency rooms, encountering the criminal justice system, and becoming homeless far too often. One reason why this problem is getting worse is because of budget cuts for mental health and addiction services at the state and local level. The American Mental Health Counselors Association reported that between 2009 and 2012, states have cut nearly $5 billion in mental health services. Mr. Chairman, I'm concerned about the impact of these cuts, and I hope that we can address them today, and also as we continue our joint efforts to work towards comprehensive mental health legislation, how we can address these cuts, because to be honest, if there are no beds for folks to go to, then anything we can do is going to be useless. And so we're going to have to work with state and local governments to figure out how to fund the appropriate amount of beds that we need. It's also important to address the issue of patients with mental illnesses showing up in the ER, which we all know is less effective and more expensive to receive treatment than other alternatives. And but I do think if these folks do show up in the ER, there are ways to improve the way they're treated there. But I also want to focus our attention on an even more important question: how can we keep people with serious mental illness out of the emergency room in the first place? When people show up in the ER, it means that they've reached a crisis point, and that represents a broader failure of our mental health system in this country. Our goal should be preventing crises from arising in the first place by investing in approaches to identify the early signs and symptoms of mental illness, and to make sure that patients have quality health insurance and can get timely and effective mental health treatment and support services. And I'll bet you every single provider, parent, and patient in this room would agree with what I just said. I don't want to downplay the concerns about the lack of inpatient beds for patients who need them. Despite our best efforts, there still will be instances where more intensive interventions are needed. But I hope that we can agree that these should be exceedingly rare occurrences and that having more inpatient beds is only a partial solution. The benefits provided by the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act and the Affordable Care Act will help prevent these ER crises if implemented correctly. They will provide millions of Americans with access to quality, affordable health insurance that includes coverage for mental health services. We need to build from these laws to support the continuum of mental health services at all levels of government. And I must say, I was very proud that we were able to include mental health parity in the Affordable Care Act. This will be very important for patients. We also need to remember that recovery, even for individuals living with serious mental illness, is possible, or certainly at least management. Mr. Rahee is proof that individuals with access to the right range of services, not only can we greatly reduce the number of individuals in crisis winding up in prisons or emergency rooms, but we can produce hardworking, contributing members of society as well. As well as your bill that you've introduced, Mr. Chairman, there's a lot of other legislation out there, and I know we intend to continue working together to try to have some kind of comprehensive legislation that will begin to address all of these issues. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentlelady for your comments, and yes, we'll continue to work together. I now recognize the gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Elmers, if you want to make an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make a brief statement, especially due to the size of our panel, and I'm very anxious to hear from all of you on these issues. You know, I served as a nurse for 21 years before coming to Congress, and there is nothing that is more heartbreaking than when you see a situation of mental illness and a family who is struggling to deal with that. I just want to say thank you to all of you. I want to take that opportunity because you coming forward will help us to finally deal with the situation, and it is a multifaceted situation, and we all have to come together. This is not a political one. This is not one that we can't reach across the aisle and work together on. So thank you to all of you, and God bless all of you.
Generally yields back. Anybody else on this side want any more of the remaining time? If not, we'll now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Waxman, for an opening statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing addresses an important issue affecting treatment and outcomes for patients with mental illnesses. We will hear today that budget cuts and other factors have resulted in a lack of inpatient beds for intensive psychiatric treatment, meaning that patients with serious mental illness who show up to the emergency room at a crisis point are forced to wait far too long, for days at a time, for an inpatient psychiatric bed. This is a growing problem, but it is not a new one. A decade ago, as ranking member of the Oversight Committee, I released a report finding that all too often jails and juvenile detention facilities have had to provide care for individuals with mental illnesses. This report found that due to a lack of available treatment, youth with serious mental disorders were placed in detention without any criminal charges pending against them. In other cases, youth who had been charged with crimes but who had served their time or were otherwise able to be released remained incarcerated for extended periods of time because no inpatient bed, residential placement, or outpatient appointment was available. That investigation found that 2/3 of juvenile detention facilities were holding youth waiting for mental health treatment, and that in one 6-month period, nearly 15,000 incarcerated youth were waiting for mental health services. Mr. Chairman, I share your desire to end these practices. That's why I supported the Affordable Care Act, which provides health insurance coverage, including coverage for mental illness, to millions of Americans. And that's why I've opposed Republican efforts to repeal this law and take this coverage away. It's also why I hope that this hearing does not ignore the elephant in the room, the impact on millions of Americans with mental illnesses of the failure by 24 states to expand their Medicaid programs under the Affordable Care Act. Last month, the American Mental Health Counselors Association released a new study titled, quote, "Dashed Hopes, Broken Promises, More Despair," end quote. And I'd like to ask that this report be made part of the hearing record.
Without objection, yes, it will be included.
Dr. Ederson is here today to testify on behalf of the organization, and I appreciate him joining us. The report found that the failure by states to expand their Medicaid programs is causing nearly 4 million people who are in serious psychological distress or who have a serious mental illness or substance disorder to go without health insurance. That's 4 million Americans in need who are left without coverage, largely because of Republican governors' ideological obsession with rejecting everything associated with the Affordable Care Act. Mr. Chairman, this includes over 200,000 people with mental illness in your home state of Pennsylvania. The report described the impact of this lack of coverage, finding that, quote, "The lack of health insurance coverage keeps people with mental illness from obtaining needed services and treatments and follow-up care with the goal of achieving long-term recovery and quality of life," end quote. This is a tragedy and a shame. If these 4 million Americans obtain coverage, they would receive better ongoing treatment and care, and they would be less likely to end up in a hospital emergency room or worse, a prison with a mental health crisis. Mr. Chairman, I know you want to help individuals with mental illnesses. We've both introduced mental health legislation, and I hope that as we move forward, we can find common ground with these bills. But the biggest and easiest step we can take to improve care for those with serious mental illnesses is to make sure they have health insurance. Medicaid expansion is a good deal for the states, and it is desperately needed by millions of Americans. This committee should be working together to make sure that regardless of where they live, Americans in all 50 states can obtain this coverage. I yield back the balance of my time.
Jim yields back. Thank you. I also have a letter from the National Association of Psychiatric Health Systems also commenting on this topic today of psychiatric beds, and so I ask without objection to include that in the record as well. I've already introduced all of our witnesses today, so I'm now going to swear you in. So you're aware the committee is holding an investigative hearing, and we have the practice of taking testimony under oath. Do any of you object to taking an oath? All right. Chair then advise you that under the rules of the House and the rules of the committee, you are entitled to be advised by counsel. Do any of you desire to be advised by counsel during your testimony today? That shouldn't be an issue. Thank you. In that case, if you would please rise and raise your right hand, and I'll swear you in. Do you swear the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. Yeah, you may now sit down, and you are under oath and subject to the penalties set forth in Title 18, Section 1001 of the United States Code. We'll now recognize each of you to give a 5-minute opening statement. Recognize first Ms. Ashley. And make sure your microphone is on and is pulled close to you. Thank you.
Hello and good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me here to tell my son's story with the emergency room department in my vicinity. I am a nurse practitioner with a master's degree. I've been in pediatric practice for 38 years, but that's not why I'm here today. I'm here as a mother of a son who is now 27 and diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia 2 years ago. It's been a long and difficult story which I share with many parents. My son was about 21 years old when I knew something was wrong, but it wasn't until he went homeless when he was in LA and went missing for 3 weeks that I knew for sure. Of course, he saw nothing wrong. When I was finally able to locate him, I brought him back to Sacramento. He was delusional, thinking the FBI was watching him. There were satellites in the sky monitoring his thoughts, having auditory hallucinations, could not have a conversation, laughing to himself and not caring for his hygiene. Prior to this, my son was extremely bright, received 740 out of 800 on his math SATs, accepted to 7 universities for mechanical engineering. His bizarre behavior went on for months, but he refused to see a psychiatrist. He was bonded to his primary medical provider, who saw him for several times, trying to get him on a hold. I felt helpless and extremely frustrated. Even calling the police did not help because they did not feel that he was a harm to himself or others. I'm specifically going to tell a story regarding his hospital emergency department stays 3 times over a 2-year period. Each time I struggled with pain and anguish to see my beautiful son taken in custody, especially for the first time, because he didn't know how sick he was and how very confused as to why he could not go home with me, and I cried my heart out. The first time was in May 2012. He had been sick over a year before I was able to get him some help. His first time in the emergency room was approximately 12 hours. I couldn't believe they had to hold him there that long, not knowing there was a shortage of psych beds in the county. He was then transferred to a psych facility locally and remained 2 weeks, just as long as my insurance would allow him. Although it was very difficult to have my son hospitalized, I know he was in good hands and relieved some of my anxiety, but still it was nothing like I had ever been through, and having to trust a system that was so foreign to you and difficult, I worried every minute. The second time was not quite as smooth. In January of 2013, my son asked voluntarily to be taken to the hospital because his head felt like it was on fire. He was anxious and very distressed. I dropped everything knowing that he was asking to go. He must have felt pretty bad. I brought him to the same emergency room that morning. We reached the triage nurse. I identified myself as an employee and a nurse practitioner. I explained my son was a paranoid schizophrenic, and he was in psychosis. I tried to remain calm as the triage nurses took his blood pressure and temperature and then assigned him to a gurney in the hallway with at least 8 other patients, which included children, all waiting to be seen by a doctor. It was not long before my son started to get agitated and wanting to leave. The RN called the social worker to help intervene. She could not quiet him down. As he tried to approach the exit, the emergency room policeman tried to stop him by holding him back. His behavior escalated. My son was screaming at him not to touch him. When schizophrenics are in psychosis, they do not want to be touched. In front of all the children and adults waiting in the hallway, the police officer wrestled him to the ground and handcuffed him. I tell you this because I brought him to the hospital for medical treatment, not for police handcuffing him, and their intervention escalating his psychosis made it worse. If he had been able to go to some kind of psych facility, he would have gotten the medical attention rather than police attention. Doctors would have known how to deal with him, calm him down, isolate him from others. The emergency room is not a quiet place, and they are not trained to deal with psychiatric illnesses, and certainly not serious mental illness. They then placed him on a gurney and put him in 4-point restraints, and then medicated him. He was there on a Friday morning, the whole day, all day Saturday, all day Sunday, and all day Monday afternoon because they could not find a psych bed anywhere. He stayed in a room tied to his bed for 4 days, heavily medicated him. Seeing him helpless, tied to a bed for days was like a nightmare. This was my son, and I was helpless except to keep him company and try to reassure him things would be all right. I was angry they couldn't find him a place. Does it really take that long to find a psych bed? Finally, on Monday, I was told there was an opening at a hospital in San Francisco, which is 100 miles east of Sacramento. They finally took him there later that day. I was unable to be involved in his care because he was so far away, except for weekends. It was very frustrating. I didn't understand why he needed to go away, so far away from his family member who cared and loved for him. By the way, if I hadn't had private insurance, he never would have gone to that hospital because they don't accept public monies. So because I had private insurance, they took him. Otherwise, who knows, he might still be there. The third time was in November. Again, his head was burning and voices were screaming at him. I took him back to the hospital. They put him on a gurney in the hallway again. I was able to be proactive and talk with other providers prior to this and set up a plan so that the second intervention would never, ever happen to him again. I was able to make some phone calls and after 2 days get him into a local psych facility where he stayed another 3 days. My son is fairly stable since that time in November. He has not required any additional hospitalization, but attends regular psychiatric visits and takes his medications regularly. And I pray every day that he continues to stay out of the emergency room because there are no other alternatives for him. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ashley. Appreciate your moving testimony. Now recognize others. I forgot to mention at a time to keep your comments to 5 minutes, so if you hear my gavel tapping, that's why. Doctor, you're next.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I am Dr. Jeffrey Geller, a board-certified psychiatrist, currently professor of psychiatry at the University of Massachusetts Medical School, medical director of the Worcester Recovery Center and Hospital, and staff psychiatrist at the Carson Community Mental Health Center. I have consulted to public mental health systems and state hospitals in 1/2 the states in the United States, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico. I am the author of 250 publications in the professional literature and the book Women of the Asylum. I serve on many professional boards, but I come here today representing only my own experience taking care of patients with serious mental illness for 40 years. Just yesterday, there were 22 psychiatric patients in a general hospital emergency room in a city of 150,000 not far from here, waiting for a disposition. Why? What's to be done? On May 3rd, 1854, President Franklin Pierce vetoed a bill that would have made the federal government responsible for America's population with serious mental illness. His veto message includes the following beliefs of his. State hospitals or public psychiatric hospitals are meritorious institutions doing good. They fulfill a historic role belonging to the states, meeting the needs of a population outside the purview of the federal government, and susceptible to becoming the responsibility of the federal government if the federal government provided any opportunity to the states to shift the burden. The federal government left the care of the serious mentally ill to the states until Congress passed and President Kennedy signed the Mental Retardation Facilities and Community Mental Health Centers Construction Act of 1963. From then until now, federal actions such as Medicaid, Medicare, the IMD exclusion, and many others have resulted in the unintended consequences of massive proportions, not the least of which is deinstitutionalization. We created the perfect formula for the current debacle, an expanding array of fiscal incentives for states to move people out of state hospitals, inadequate resources to meet the needs of state residents with serious mental illness in the community, no beds in state hospitals to meet the needs of former state hospital patients who did not find the community the panacea promised by the Supreme Court and were dangerous outside of hospitals, no beds to meet the needs of new cases of serious mental illness requiring hospital level of care, and a public more willing to build jails and prisons than hospitals because they found no solace in a state system they saw as pushing ill-prepared folks with mental illness into their neighborhoods. How did this lead to individuals waiting in hospital emergency departments or EDs for weeks, sometimes a month? Pick any state. There are no available beds in the state's public psychiatric hospitals because there are too few beds. A patient on the psychiatric unit in a general hospital has been approved for transfer to the state hospital but cannot be transferred because there's no available bed. Thus, the general hospital psychiatric unit is populated by some patients who are stuck there awaiting state hospital transfer. An individual is brought to the general hospital's emergency department by police, family, ambulance, or comes on her own. The individual is assessed and determined to need hospitalization. The individual cannot be admitted to the psychiatric unit in the same hospital as the emergency department because there are no beds there. What happens next is a hospital emergency department staff or a member of a contracted crisis team starts a bed search. A bed search means calling every hospital in the state seeking a bed. Frequently, the bed search is fruitless. There's no beds available anywhere because all the hospitals are in the same situation as the psychiatric unit and the hospital worker is calling from. So the individual remains in the emergency department waiting for an available bed. The days of waiting benefit no one. The ED becomes overcrowded. The patient is a patient in name only. He is not getting treatment, except that he is receiving food, a bed or gurney, and maybe some medication. He might as well be waiting on a bench in a train station. Or the individual is simply released from the emergency department because there's no place else for her to go. The threshold for holding somebody in the emergency department awaiting admission keeps creeping up. Many released folks are picked up by the police, processed through the courts, sent to the state hospital for a forensic evaluation, further decreasing available beds to the person awaiting a bed in the emergency department. Congress can enact measures to ameliorate the problems of boarders in emergency departments. These include provide states with opportunities to obtain IMD exclusion waivers with maintenance of effort, make SSI and SSDI payments to eligible individuals independent of where they reside, and require their contribution for room and board to be the same in all locations, including jails and prisons. Individuals keep their Medicaid and Medicare in all settings. Improve the federal grant process for research into prevention and early intervention. Provide grants to states to create or expand crisis intervention teams so that such a program is available in every city and town. Set fair and reasonable Medicaid payment rates for psychiatric services at community mental health centers and federally qualified health centers. Incentivize states to actually use the assisted outpatient treatment statutes they have. Define Medicaid and Medicare payments to clubhouses in ways that do not destroy the mission of clubhouses. Incentivize states to establish mental health courts. Mr. Chairman, representatives, it's time the federal government took explicit action through bipartisan, bicameral efforts to remedy the calamitous state of the public care and treatment of persons with serious mental illness in the United States today. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Hirschhorn, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
In emergency departments throughout the country, we emergency physicians expect the unexpected. This is what we're trained to do. Even so, there's one thing that we all know is happening: increasing demand by patients in need of acute psychiatric care. Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to testify today on behalf of the American College of Emergency Physicians. ACEP is the largest specialty organization in emergency medicine, with more than 32,000 members in all 50 states and the District of Columbia. My purpose today is to help you understand that we're in the midst of a national crisis, facing a dramatic increase in vulnerable mental health patients seeking emergent and urgent care. America's mental health services are experiencing increased demand while concurrently receiving decreased funding, which drives psychiatric patients to the ED or emergency department. In 2000, psychiatric patients to the ED accounted for only 5.4% of all ED visits, but by 2007, that number had risen to 12.5%, well over a doubling of the number of psychiatric patients. Until more services and fundings are made available to address this crisis, EDs will be the safety net for these patients. This is due in large part to the Federal Emergency Medicine Treatment and Labor Act, EMTALA, which mandates medical screening, evaluation, and stabilization for anyone seeking care in an ED. Additionally, unlike many other health care settings, EDs are open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every day of the year. Emergency physicians do their best to provide care to patients with psychiatric conditions, but the ED is not the ideal location for these services. ED crowding leads to delays in care and have been associated with poor clinical outcomes. For patients with mental health and/or substance abuse problems, prolonged ED stays are associated with increased risk of worsening symptoms. Without available appropriate inpatient resources for admitted patients, these patients wait or are boarded in the ED until an inpatient bed becomes available or an accepting facility can be found. When the normal capacity of the ED is overwhelmed with boarded patients, there remains absolutely no room for surge capacity, which would be critical in the event of a man-made or natural disaster. In a recent ACEP survey, 99% of emergency physicians reported admitting psychiatric patients daily, while 80% said that they were boarding psychiatric patients in their EDs. Acutely ill psychiatric patients require more physician, more nurse, and more hospital resources. ED staff spends more than 3 times as long looking for a psychiatric bed as they would for a non-psychiatric patient. Other factors contribute to the extended ED boarding times for psychiatric patients, including defensive medicine or threat of legal action, required pre-authorization for inpatient services, medical clearance prior to psychiatric evaluation, substance abuse-related issues, and inadequate outpatient services. As can be seen, many of these issues are systems issues and beyond the control of the clinician. It is imperative that access to high-quality inpatient and community mental health care be a priority. I go into further detail on suggested solutions in my written testimony, but some important ones include full capacity protocols to improve the movement of admitted patients to inpatient floors, separate psychiatric, ED, and behavioral health annexes to help address urgent and emergent psychiatric needs, regionalized care and telemedicine to help efficiently and effectively address increasing demand, as well as the elimination of out-of-network insurance issues and community state mental health buy-in. Let me leave you with this. The increasing burden of mental illness in this country, combined with the lack of resources to care for these individuals, is a national crisis. Mass deinstitutionalization of mental health patients over the past few decades did not result in successful community integration of individuals needing psychiatric services, in part because the necessary services and funding were not put in place for adequate community support. Systematic changes are needed in the way we care for these individuals with mental illness in this country. How we deal with these vulnerable individuals is an important measure of who we are as a society. Necessary resources must be made available for additional inpatient and outpatient treatment beds with the corresponding professional staff, as well as for critically needed research. Otherwise, mental health services will continue to deteriorate, and these individuals, often our family members, will continue to be at risk for abuse and neglect, seeking care in EDs for lack of any other support. I thank you for your attention to this alarming problem.
Thank you, Doctor. Chief Basadi, you can put that microphone right up next to you, please. Thank you.
Good morning, Chairman Murphy and Ms. DeGette. I'm the immediate past president of the New York State Association of Chiefs of Police and Chief of Police in New Windsor, New York. I'm in my 38th year of service. My wife, Barbara, who is a psychologist, is here today with me. We have a daughter with schizophrenia who has been involuntarily hospitalized in excess of 20 times. Barbara and I met when she, like many moms, turned to the police for help when her, now our daughter, became psychotic, disruptive, and threatening. She was self-medicating, unemployed, and deteriorating despite my wife's heroic efforts to help her. Then she went into assisted outpatient treatment. It saved her life. In 2011, while at the United States Naval Postgraduate School's Center for Homeland Defense and Security, I published a survey of over 2,400 senior law enforcement officers titled Management of the Severely Mentally Ill and Its Effects on Homeland Security. It found the mentally ill consume a disproportionate percentage of law enforcement resources. Many commit low-level crimes. 160,000 attempt suicide, 3 million become crime victims, and 164,000 are homeless each year. The survey essentially found that we have two mental health systems today serving two mutually exclusive populations. Community programs serve those who seek and accept treatment. Those who refuse or are too sick to seek voluntary treatment become law enforcement responsibilities. Officers in the survey were frustrated that mental health officials seemed unwilling to recognize or take responsibility for this second, more symptomatic group. Ignoring them puts patients at risk, the public, and police. It costs more than keeping care within the mental health system. As an example, there are fewer than 100,000 mentally ill in psychiatric hospitals, but over 300,000 in jails and prisons. The officers I surveyed pointed out the drain on resources it takes to investigate, arrest, fill out paperwork, and participate in the trials of all of them. Add to that the sheriffs, district attorneys, judges, prisons, jails, and corrections officers it takes to manage each of them, and you see the scope of the problem. Many more related incidents like suicides, fights, nuisance calls take police time but don't result in arrest or incarceration. Overly restrict commitment standards and the shortage of hospital beds are major sources of frustration for officers. Hospitals are so overcrowded they often can't admit new patients and discharge many before they are completely stable. They become what we call round trippers or frequent flyers. One officer referred to it as a human catch and release program. Anyone who asks for help is generally not sick enough to be admitted, so involuntary admission, that is, being a danger to self or others, becomes the main pathway for treatment. Officers are called to diffuse situations and then have to drive, in some cases, hours to transport individuals to hospitals and then wait for hours in the emergency rooms, only to find the hospital refuses admission because there are no beds, or that the commitment standard is so restrictive. The only remaining solution for our officers is to arrest these people with serious mental illness for whatever minor violation exists, something that we're loath to do to sick people who need medical help, not incarceration. Finally, while everyone knows that everyday mental illness is not associated with violence, untreated serious mental illness clearly is. The officers in this survey deal with that reality every day. You in Congress dealt with it when Ronald Reagan and Gabrielle Giffords were shot, 2 guards in the Capitol building were killed, and the Navy Yard shooting happened. Representatives DeGette, Gardner, and Griffiths have experienced the worst of the worst in their states. We have to stop pretending that violence is not associated with untreated serious mental illness. We have to stop pretending that everyone is well enough to volunteer for treatment and then self-direct their own care. Some clearly are not. As I wrote in the intro to the survey, police and sheriffs are being overwhelmed dealing with the unintended consequences of a policy change that in effect removed the daily care of our nation's severely mentally ill population from the medical community and placed it with the criminal justice system. This policy change has caused a spike in the frequency of arrests of severely mentally ill persons, prisons, jail populations, as well as homeless populations, and has become a major consumer of law enforcement resources nationwide. If I could make one recommendation, it would be to prevent individuals from deteriorating to the point where law enforcement becomes involved. Return care and treatment of the most seriously ill back to the mental health system. Make the seriously mentally ill first in line for services rather than last. As a law enforcement officer and a father, I know that treatment before tragedy is a far better policy than treatment after tragedy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chief. Ms. Starr, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the committee for having me here today. I'm the sheriff of Cook County, and as the sheriff, I run the Cook County Jail, which is the largest single-site jail in the country. My office is in the jail. Our average daily population is between 10,000 to 12,000 inmates, and it costs about $143 a day to house someone there. Since becoming sheriff in 2006, I have seen an explosion in the percentage of seriously mentally ill individuals housed in the jail. I've seen firsthand the devastating impact cuts to mental health programs and services have had on the mentally ill in Illinois. This is a crisis we must all care about because it affects all of us. I find it ironic that in the 50s we thought it was inhumane to house people in state hospitals, but now in the 21st century we're okay with them being in jails and prisons. On any given day, an average of 30 to 35% of my population suffers from a serious mental illness. The diagnoses fall into two main categories: mood disorders such as major depressive disorder or bipolar disorder, or psychotic disorders such as schizophrenia. While some mentally ill individuals are charged with violent offenses, the majority are charged with crimes seemingly committed to survive, including retail theft, trespassing, prostitution, and drug possession. A cursory review of our statistics tell the story. Last year, in one of my living units, 1,265 men were in that dorm on low-level drug-related offenses. The average length of stay was 87 days. At $143 a day, it cost over $12,000 just to house these individuals pre-trial because they cannot afford to post minimal bail or have nowhere to live. Many of these inmates ultimately are sentenced to probation more often than not, or sentenced to time served while they were sitting with me. The unfortunate and undeniable conclusion is that because of the dramatic and sustained cuts in mental health funding, we have criminalized mental illness in this country, and county jails and state prison facilities are where the majority of the mental health care and treatment is administered. 3 recent cases illustrate this. JJ was arrested by Chicago Police Department last May after a failed attempt to steal sheets or towels from a local Walgreens drugstore. When we spoke to him shortly after his arrest, he explained that he took the items off the shelf as he walked past the cashier, and he just asked her to charge him. He was arrested, charged with retail theft. The value of the items he stole were $29.99. He spent 110 days in my jail before sentenced to probation. During his custody, he was stabilized on medication, received drug and mental health treatment. The taxpayers of Cook County spent close to $16,000 after his failed attempt to steal $29 worth of sheets. JD suffers from a psychotic disorder and has visions that terrify him. He was arrested in California on a warrant from my county. While in custody in California, he removed one of his eyeballs in an attempt to stop seeing his visions. He lost sight in that eye, so we were alerted to this issue. He was transferred to our custody 2 weeks ago and recently attempted to remove his other eye. While staff acted quickly, we were able to stop that from occurring. We presently have him where he wears a helmet and face mask and has gloves on his hands. TA was arrested over 100 times. Her most recent arrest came after she attempted to steal $20 from a person's purse during a church service. She's a chronic self-mutilator. She attacks her arms with her own fingernails or any object she can find. To keep her safe while in our custody, we make a special mittens for her that go up to her armpits. Incredibly, she was sentenced to a prison term and recently was transferred to state hospital. We are awaiting right now her imminent return to Chicago. She has cost us conservatively, the taxpayers, over $1 million since for all of her custody. What we have done in our county now is my staff interviews every detainee before they appear in bond court regarding their mental health history. Those who admit to a history are identified for the public defender's office, and then we'd make efforts to try to appeal to the judges for alternative programs. Unlike state prisoners who have fixed release dates, pretrial detainees may be released at any time, which significantly complicates our ability to provide discharge planning. The inmates are often written information on available community resources, enrollment in county care, and allowed access to a telephone to contact someone to arrange for transportation home or to identified housing. If the inmate requires discharge to a facility on the next day, we will shelter them overnight before we'll try to get them to a hospital. If the inmate requires assistance with transportation to his or her home or shelter, we will drive them there. If the inmate is stable, coordinated releases are typically initiated by our healthcare provider. The steps are followed. Additionally, we communicate with the party the inmate is being released to. Once it is confirmed the party is outside the jail, someone from our records unit will go out there to make sure that person's there. The past practice always had been we would release them out to the street where they would wander around aimlessly for hours, if not days. If the inmate is unstable in need of psychiatric hospitalization in the community, he or she is petitioned by a licensed mental health professional. A certificate for involuntary hospitalization is completed by psychiatrists and accompanies the individual to the receiving hospital. Finally, in August, I launched a mental health helpline. It's a 24-hour helpline dedicated to assisting former mentally ill detainees or families of mentally ill detainees. The phone line is manned by members of my policy team and supported by our mental health staff. It has been an invaluable resource to the families who communicate with us through this helpline. We receive calls on this helpline 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In conclusion, we are in an unsustainable position. I often refer to the jail as the last car in a long train. Every single day, at every step before a person comes into the jail, there is discretion to arrest, to charge, and to set bond. But as custodian, I'm obligated to care for these individuals. Every day I'm faced with the mental health crisis in this county and in the country. I see the pain of those suffering from mental illness and the pain of their families who have struggled to care for them and provide them with resources. The question that plagues me, that keeps me up at night, is where do we go from here? As that question is debated, I will continue to do all I can to care for and protect for the look for increased funding to address mental illness in our country, and will continue to provide the best care I can for the mentally ill. This is truly a crisis that we can no longer ignore. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheriff. I now recognize Judge Leifman for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee. My name is Steve Leifman. I am a judge from Miami-Dade County, and I chair the Florida Supreme Court Task Force on Substance Abuse, Mental Illness, and Issues in the Court. You ask, where have the patients gone? Sadly, the answer is jail and prisons, and this is an American travesty. As you already stated, in 1955, there were some 550,000 people in state psychiatric hospitals around this country. If nothing had changed and we use today's population, there would have been about 1.5 million people in state psychiatric hospitals today. Last year, 1.5 million people with serious mental illnesses were arrested in this country. On any given day in the United States, we have approximately 500,000 people with serious mental illnesses in jails and prisons, and another 850,000 in the community on some type of community control or probation. Since 1955, we have closed 90% of the hospital beds in this country, and we have seen a corresponding increase of 400% of the number of people going to jail with mental illnesses. And because jails are not conducive to treatment and courts do not know what to do with this population, people with mental illnesses generally stay 4 to 8 times longer in jail than anyone else with the exact same charge who does not have a mental illness, and costs 7 times more. I had no idea that when I became a judge, I was actually becoming the gatekeeper to the largest psychiatric facility in the state of Florida, and tragically, that's the Miami-Dade County Jail. I see more people on any given day with mental illness than most psychiatrists see in a month. People with mental illnesses in this country are 3 times more likely to be arrested than to be hospitalized, and in my state, it is 9 times more likely. The closing of the hospitals is not the only and primary reason all these individuals have ended up in hospitals. It is a combination that created the perfect storm. It includes the IMD exclusion. It includes what Medicaid pays for its services. It includes the war on drugs. It includes the reduction of hospital beds. It includes the antiquated involuntary hospital laws. They have all conspired to create this perfect storm. And if this wasn't bad enough, just listen to the cost this is having to our communities. We worked with the Florida Mental Health Institute, the University of South Florida in Tampa. We wanted to know who the highest utilizers of criminal justice and mental health services were in my county so that we could wrap our arms around this population to see if we could get them services so they didn't keep reoffending. I thought I would get a list of thousands of individuals back. They sent me a list of 97 people, and I guarantee every one of you have these same 97 in your communities. These 97 individuals, primarily men, primarily diagnosed with schizophrenia, over 5 years were arrested 2,200 times. They spent 27,000 days in the Dade County Jail, 13,000 days at a psychiatric hospital or an emergency room, and cost taxpayers $13 million, and we got absolutely nothing for it. We would have been better off sending them to Harvard and maybe giving them an opportunity for an education. It is an outrage. The other part of the problem is that where we spend our money is killing us. In Florida, we spend 1/3 of all of our adult public mental health dollars, that's almost $250 million, to try to restore competency for 2,700 people. We have between 170 and 180,000 people in any given year in Florida who at the time of their arrest need acute mental health care treatment. But we spend 1/3 of our money trying to restore competency so we can try these 2,700 people. Well, 70% of these individuals have 3 things happen to them. Either the charges are dropped because the witnesses disappear, they get credit time served because they've been in the system so long and they walk out of the front door of the courthouse without any access to treatment, or they get probation and they walk out of the courthouse without any access to treatment, and we've just spent $250 million, and that money is coming out of the community mental health system, making it harder for people to get access. It actually meets the definition of insanity. We keep doing the same thing again and again, and we expect a different outcome. It's even worse at the prison level. And on the competency restoration, in the United States, we're spending almost $3.5 billion, and we're getting very little return for that money. The fastest growing population in Florida's prisons are people with mental illnesses. While our prison population has begun to stabilize over the last 2 years, the mental health population continues to grow at exceedingly alarming rates. Over the last 15 years, the serious percentage of people with mental illness has grown by 178%. We went from about 6,500 people with serious mental illnesses 15 years ago to 18,000 today. It's going so fast that it's projected to double again in the next 10 years. Florida needs to start building 10 new prisons for the next 10 years just to get to this population. It will cost my state $3.5 billion to deal with this population if we don't do something soon to correct the problem. We are looking at huge cost, and we're getting very little for our outcome. We have a 3-legged stool that is wobbling and about to break, and there are 3 parts that I really hope that you are able to address. The first part is how and what we finance through federal Medicaid dollars for mental health services. It doesn't work. The second somebody is no longer a danger to self or others, Medicaid will cut them off, and the hospital will discharge them back to the community, often to homelessness, often into the criminal justice system. The second part that needs to be addressed is the antiquated involuntary hospitalization laws. Most of these laws were written before we had TV, microwave ovens, computers, brain imaging, and antipsychotic medication. It is an absurdity. The first laws come from 1788 out of New York. It doesn't work. People cannot get into the system to get treatment, and then when they're ready to be discharged, there's nothing for them. We have made, and the third part is that we need to have a coordinated system in the criminal justice system to make sure we can take care of this population. And just let me make 2 quick points. We are doing some significant things in Miami-Dade County that are having huge impacts. We have trained over 4,000 police officers in order to identify people with mental illnesses in the community. Last year, the city of Miami and Miami-Dade County did 10,000 mental health calls. These 4,000 officers only made 27 arrests out of these 10,000 calls. Our jail audit plummeted from 7,800 to 5,000, allowing the county to close a jail and saving $12 million. We also have post-arrest diversion programs where if someone comes in, we get them treated and make sure that they're not just discharged to the community without any assistance. We're saving lives, we're saving dollars, and we're starting to make this system work. But we need to fix those other 3 pieces. We also need to begin to use advanced technology, which we are beginning to do. We are part of a unique private and public partnership in Dade County where we're working to see if predictive analytics can actually be used in the behavioral health space so that we can have an unfragmented system of care, more accountability, and make sure that people with mental illnesses are treated fairly and properly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judge. I was afraid to gavel a judge.
And I appreciate that, and I won't hold anyone in contempt today, so I appreciate the reciprocation.
I don't think this is your jurisdiction, so we're good.
Thank you.
But thank you for your testimony. Mr. Stern, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you for hearing me today. I'm here to talk about people who are homeless with severe untreated mental illness. I've been working with homeless people for nearly 30 years. For the last 24 at Georgetown Ministry Center. Our goal back in 1990 was to put ourselves out of business by ending homelessness. Instead, homelessness has become a career for me and so many others. It has now been 10 years since cities around the country, including Washington, D.C., issued their 10-year plan to end homelessness. Not much has changed. Why is homelessness so hard to solve? From my perspective, it's because we lack the tools to intervene when a person's life has devolved to the point where he or she is moved out onto the street because of an untreated mental illness. When I began to work with the homeless population nearly 30 years ago, deinstitutionalization was in full swing. At the time, many people I was working with were cycling in and out of hospitals. The community mental health centers were trying to figure out what their role was. As deinstitutionalization has continued, I've noticed that it is increasingly harder to access beds for people in acute psychiatric crisis. In the past 2 years, I've only seen 2 people admitted to the hospital. More typically now, people referred for psychiatric crisis care get poor or no intervention and are returned to the street, almost always because they refuse treatment. Georgetown Ministry Center brings free psychiatric and medical care to the streets, but very few people with untreated mental illness are willing to engage in conversations with our psychiatrists about their mental health. It's the nature of the illness. However, when we talk about a shortage of beds for treatment, we are not talking about the people I work with, because these people with limited or no insight into their illness don't think they need treatment and vehemently refuse treatment when it is offered. Homeless people are real people with families like yours and mine, families that care. Greg is someone I met sitting on a park bench near our center. He was shabbily dressed and smelled bad. He would drink, I assumed, to tame the voices that I knew he heard because of the frequent spontaneous smiles and grimaces. All this belied the fact that Greg was once a gifted constitutional lawyer who delighted his children with his dry wit. They were in their late teens when he began to show the signs of what would become a profoundly disabling bipolar disorder. Not long after, he disappeared. He would call occasionally on birthdays or out of the blue for no reason. The kids tried so hard to keep up with him. They wanted desperately to make him whole again, but it was futile. Greg drifted from city to city around the country, ending up in our center, ultimately in our small shelter one winter 8 years ago. Greg was a delight some of the time. His thick Southern drawl and witty conversation would enchant volunteers, but other times he was withdrawn and surly. In January of 2006, Greg became sick. We encouraged him to go to the hospital, and he said that he would. Instead, he disappeared. A week later, I received a call from the medical examiner's office. They needed a body identified. It was Greg. The bodies never looked the way you remember a person. Only Greg's face and hair showed from the white shroud covering his body. It took a few moments to work out that these were the features of the person that I once knew. A few years later, I met Greg's 2 adult children. They had learned he had died in Washington 3 years after the fact. Each of them traveled, one from New York, the other from Phoenix, to meet here and see the place where their dad spent his final days. They needed to know what his last days were like. I shared coffee with them, and they told stories about him, and they asked questions about his final days. They laughed and they cried. You could tell that they loved and missed their father. There are so many stories I could tell if I had time, about mothers, brothers, sons, daughters who have wept for their relatives lost to mental illness. If the families had the tools to intervene, they would intervene. Most of all, what I want to impart here is that people who live on the street are real people with families and hopes and dreams abandoned because of an illness that has robbed them of their competency. The other important takeaway is that almost all of the people I see on the street are there because they have refused treatment, not for rational reason, but because illness has insidiously robbed them of their insight to understand that they have an illness and that treatment can help them. So finally, what I've concluded after nearly 30 years of working with people who are homeless is that all I can do is provide some comfort and harm reduction. Until we are given tools for more assertive interventions, we will not resolve homelessness. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stern. Mr. Rahim, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Murphy, Ranking Member DeGette, and members of the subcommittee. My journey with mental illness began in 1998 during my freshman year at Harvard University. That fall, I experienced a terrifying panic attack. In that episode, I had heart palpitations, sweaty palms, and dizziness. Yet I did not know it was an anxiety-induced state. What I did know, however, was the deep terror I felt. My journey continued when I had my first manic episode. During the spring of 1999, I roamed the streets of Hempstead, New York, possessed with a prophetic delusion that I had to share with any and everyone I met. Concerned, my parents sent me to my father's homeland of Grenada to relax and be with family. However, while there, I plunged into a deep depression. I returned to Harvard that fall and struggled through the year battling anxiety and depression. In the spring of 2000, I was consumed by my second manic episode. My next 2 weeks were filled with sleepless nights and endless writing sessions. I showered less frequently and ate sporadically. During this manic episode, I experienced psychosis. I had visions of Jesus, heard cars talking, and spoke foreign languages. Upon hearing my condition, my parents rushed to pick me up from Harvard's campus. That same evening, my parents decided to take me to a psychiatric hospital in Queens. When we arrived to the emergency room, I was taken to the triage area. Over the next few hours, I was held in a curtained room in the ER. I tossed and turned and remained restless, as now I had not slept in 24 hours. My parents sat in the curtained room with me until I was admitted to the hospital later that night. Accompanied by 2 hospital aides, I was transported to the psychiatric ward in a hospital van. I walked through a dimly lit ward door and was met by approximately 6 staff members. They gave me a hospital gown, requested that I change into it, and encouraged me to relax when I noted my agitated state. They noted my agitated state. When I continued to toss, the staff stated that they were going to put straps around my arms and legs. After placing the straps, they then said they were going to give me a sedative to help me sleep. I felt a prick in my upper arm. The next morning, I awoke, drowsy and unable to speak. I walked to the common room of the ward. I sat down and began to hold my breath. I received another sedative. I was hospitalized for 2 weeks. The first week is a blur due to my mental confusion and the psychiatric medication administered to me. However, I do remember some of my experiences. I interacted frequently with staff and the other patients. One staff member I felt an affinity towards and spoke with him frequently. He advised me to focus on getting better and not to come back to the hospital as so many other patients had. My psychiatrist on the ward diagnosed me with bipolar disorder, and I briefly explained that I would be on several medications. Upon my release from the hospital, I found and met a psychiatrist in Brooklyn. During my hospitalization, I accepted my illness and began my arduous road to recovery. Cannot pinpoint what triggered me to my immediate acceptance, but I'm grateful that it did not take years for me to obtain insight. Over the course of my 16-year journey with mental illness, I have simultaneously embraced my diagnosis and realized that I'm more than a label. I've embraced that I am more than medication, therapist appointments, and support groups. I've learned that I'm not bipolar, I'm Hakeem Rahee, not just one piece of my treatment regimen. At the same time, I've learned a good treatment regimen has to be accompanied by positive coping skills, diet, exercise for brain health, along with spirituality and spiritual perspective. The biggest challenge I faced to getting where I am today was openly acknowledging my mental illness. For so long, I felt a deep and personal shame for having bipolar disorder. This shame was so entrenched that I felt uncomfortable sharing my diagnosis with close friends and even family members. In 2012, I decided to speak openly and join NAMI's In Our Own Voice program. Through the In Our Own Voice program, I have shared my story with over 600 people, including individuals living with mental illness and their family members. Currently, I'm the NAMI Queens Nassau Let's Talk Mental Illness presenter. Through the Let's Talk Mental Illness program, I've shared my story and provided much needed awareness to over 5,000 high school students and middle school students at 37 schools. I see the importance in and will continue to speak up for mental health and mental illness education in schools and beyond. Millions of people in America desire to give voice to their struggles but cannot because of stigma. I'm fueled by the desire to break the silence. I'm inspired by students who want to learn about mental illness to help a friend or a struggling parent who is hurting. I'm strengthened by people who have decided to out themselves in an effort to normalize mental illness. Mental illness education and awareness is essential to combat stigma, end suffering, and normalize seeking help. I'm grateful to my parents, family, and loved ones who have supported me. I'm also grateful for this committee for picking up this topic and as well as this panel, because I believe it's my hope that the ideas put forward today will transform the already shifting conversation around mental illness, and I thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Rahee. Appreciate that. Dr. Ederson.
My name is Dr. Lamar Ederson, and I wish to thank the chairman, ranking member, for the opportunity to testify today at this very important hearing on the psychiatric bed shortage. My doctorate is in psychology. I'm a clinical mental health counselor and licensed marriage and family therapist. The population we are focusing on today is the population that I primarily serve in my private practice. Over the past year, I have served as the Director of Large for the American Mental Health Counselors Association, also known as AMCA. I'm here representing AMCA's 7,100 members. I am also a board member and two-time past president of the New Mexico Mental Health Counselors Association. Clinical mental health counselors are primary mental health care providers who offer high-quality, comprehensive, integrative, cost-effective services across the lifespan of the individual. We are uniquely qualified licensed clinicians trained to provide mental health assessment, prevention, diagnosis, and treatment. I grew up as a child in the welfare system with inadequate health care insurance. Since the age of 18, I have provided health care for patients. My career began as an enlisted member of the United States Air Force, where I served for 20 years as a medic. As a clinical mental health counselor, I now see children, adults, and families in private practice in Albuquerque, New Mexico. My specialty is trauma. Evidence all around us demonstrates the nation's mental health care system is in crisis. It is generating increased demand for inpatient psychiatric beds while simultaneously decreasing its supply. Because patients have trouble accessing services in the community, they use the emergency department for basic and intermediate care. Our current mental health system still suffers from poor transition from inpatient institutions to community-based treatment. In a recent scholarly article, Ms. Nalini Pandey estimated that psychiatric boarding lost nearly $4 million a year in revenue from service that could have been provided in lieu of boarding at just one 450-bed teaching hospital here. Ms. Pandey also found that as patients waited, sometimes for hours, some for days, their psychiatric health deteriorated. And a patient who often came in with manageable psychiatric illness subsequently turned into patients with acute needs. But still, there's more than meets the eye. We at AMCA believe some policymakers are going down the wrong path in addressing the problem of hospital boarding. The barrier to treatment is accessing timely, effective, quality mental health service in the community. Surmounting these barriers requires continuous comprehensive health insurance coverage that enables access to essential inpatient and outpatient care, prescription drugs, early intervention, and prevention programs. All of those essential benefits are provided in health plans governed by the Affordable Care Act and new state Medicaid expansion programs, and some are available to Medicare beneficiaries as well. We can make smarter to have a better, healthier system that systematically reduces crisis situations from developing. In addition to the importance of state Medicaid expansion, Medicare mental health services, too, have never been fully modernized to include newer providers like clinical mental health counselors and marriage and family therapists, such as proposed by Representatives Chris Gibson and Mike Thompson in H.R. 3662. Comprehensive and stable health insurance coverage is the key to cost-effective, efficient, timely mental health services in the United States. The new state Medicaid expansion effort has the potential for millions of currently uninsured Americans with mental health diagnoses to obtain greatly expanded access to mental health and substance use treatment in an integrated community-based setting with a person-centered treatment focus, the exact objectives I believe all policymakers are trying to achieve today. Unfortunately, 25 states are refusing to participate in the new Medicaid expansion program, which will continue to leave millions of uninsured people with serious mental health conditions out in the coverage code. AMCA believes it is a huge and costly mistake that Congress under Medicare and state policymakers under Medicaid have decided to deny their most vulnerable citizens state health insurance coverage with comprehensive health care and mental health services. In summary, Medicare mental health provider, coverage modernization, and state Medicaid expansion will provide health insurance coverage to millions of people with serious mental health conditions who have had difficulty accessing needed and timely service. These changes are necessary to dramatically reduce the chances of future crisis situations and increasing emergency department visits. Thank you again for the opportunity to present this testimony today before the committee.
Thank you, Doctor. Appreciate that. Dr. Evans, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Dr. Murphy, Ranking Member Representative DeGette, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to participate in this hearing. I'm Dr. Arthur C. Evans, Jr., Commissioner of the Philadelphia Department of Behavioral Health and Intellectual Disability Services, and I also have a faculty appointment at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. I appear here today on behalf of the American Psychological Association, which is the largest scientific and professional organization representing psychology. As a commissioner of a Department of Behavioral Health, my job is to ensure that the resources are deployed to address the needs of 1.5 million people in the city of Philadelphia. So today what I wanted to do is to talk as an administrator, as someone who's trained as both a scientist and a practitioner, and also a family member myself. And I want to start by saying I think all of the issues that we've heard today are solvable problems. I absolutely believe that. I think we have evidence both in Philadelphia and around the country that all of the issues that we've heard today are solvable, I think, with political will, with resources, and with leadership. I think, and I really appreciate the family members who have testified today, and especially Mr. Rahee, who gave his personal story, because I think that we have to hear that people can and do recover. And I want to start my comments by just giving a few examples of things that I think that we can do to improve the nation's mental health systems. First of all, people can and do recover. And we know from the research, we know from clinical practice, that given the right resources, given the right types of services, people can do really well who have even the most serious forms of mental illness. Unfortunately, our systems are set up in a way that they don't acknowledge that. We have systems that are geared towards maintaining people, addressing people when they're in crisis, and you heard some of the stories of people who have family members who have a very difficult time getting help. And the reason that is because of the way we finance our mental health system. It is diagnostically driven. People have to either have a diagnosis or to be in crisis. So one of the first issues I think we have to take on is how are we financing our services, and are we doing things that, and are we financing our service system in such a way that we have the resources to do outreach and to do early intervention. Secondly, I think that any discussion around psychiatric bed capacity has to deal with the efficiency of the current system. There are a number of things that we can do to improve the current efficiency, and I'll give you a couple of examples from Philadelphia. We have in Philadelphia a unit that has people who historically would have been in the state hospital, very long lengths of stay, numbering sometimes in the months. We've employed evidence-based practices, both on the unit and in deploying ACT teams or assertive community treatment teams who've also been trained up in evidence-based practices. And we're starting to see a reduction in lengths of stay. I use that as an example because when we talk about increasing bed capacity and not addressing the inefficiencies in the current system, it's not a good use of our resources, and I think we have to take on those issues. Similarly, we use a pay-for-performance system because we believe as a payer that it's really important to have accountability around the services that are provided. We have saved over $4 million over a 2-year period simply by working with our inpatient treatment providers, focusing on things like continuity of care, making sure that when people are admitted that if they have a case manager, that those people are coming on to the units, working with people so that there's a smooth transition. Those kinds of efficiencies can go a long way in increasing capacity. I also believe that we have to have a public health strategy. We cannot have simply a treatment strategy around this. When people have difficulty getting into services. Sometimes that is because people don't know how to navigate the system, but often it is because there is stigma associated with mental illness that prevents people from reaching out for help. And so part of our strategies have to be to reduce stigma and make it more likely for people to reach out for help. That's one of the reasons that we support things like mental health first aid that help people to understand how to intervene. Fourthly, I think that we have to think about cross-systems financing. Many of the issues, if you talk to mental health commissioners around the country and you ask them what are the top 3 issues, I would almost guarantee you that every single one of them would have housing as one of their top issues related to the administration of their system. And so as we're talking about this, we have to think not only about services within the mental health system, but we have to think about other services that people need to be successful. So with that, I will stop, and hopefully we will have questions that we can talk more about those.
Thank you, Dr. Herbens. As we go into comments here or questions from members of Congress, I just want to have a special thank you for this panel. We've had a number of hearings and panels on this issue of mental health, and I recognize members have very busy lives, and some are at other hearings in other areas, but for those members who missed your testimony, I think their lives are the poorer for it. And as I watch how someone will walk through the system, it's pretty difficult. So let me recognize myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Ashley, your experience you related to us in your testimony concerning your son's admission and boarding in a local ER from hours to days. I mean, it's alarming to us. So were there any other places in the area, or were you informed of any other place in the area where you could have taken your son instead of having those long delays in the hospital?
You mean another emergency room?
Yes.
Oh, well, my insurance only pays for the hospital that we went to.
Okay. And Dr. Hirschman, in this case, and we had heard this also in the, for example, in 60 Minutes when State Senator Creed Dees was talking about his own son, he couldn't find a place. Is that part of the problem that occurs too with emergency rooms in terms of getting someone to find?
Yeah, the issue of finding an inpatient facility can be very problematic. You have to find a place that's going to accept that patient, and historically there may have been insurance issues as well. And so, you know, in Maryland we've tried to devise mechanisms to improve this. One of the things we have now is a kind of a central listing of the hospitals that have inpatient facilities that have beds available. But even that is problematic, getting the hospitals to buy into it. So this is a traditional problem. This is especially if you have someone who's got a dual diagnosis, perhaps they're, you know, adolescent with bipolar and maybe substance abuse. They can wait. I've had friends had patients wait for 13 days in their emergency department looking for a place to stay.
Thank you. Sheriff Dart, any idea what your total cost per year in dealing with folks with mental illness in your jail are?
You know, Mr. Chairman, that's always been a difficult number for us to ascertain, but just as a rule of thumb, it's in the ballpark, clearly double, closer to triple the cost of an average detainee. So we're talking just tripling every expense that we have there. But the difficulty where it gets to be sort of quantifying this is that they come back to us so quickly. So it isn't even as just if you took the one detainee and say, okay, he costs more than the other ones, and just
you talk about some of those costs, like $12,000 for pretrial costs and other things with that. Now, is any of this federal money that's used to help these patients, these inmates while they're there? Nothing.
No, virtually none of it's all county-related money.
Okay. Let me ask also in this past winter, I heard about a homeless man who was had mental illness, but in Washington D.C. they couldn't take him in because it was only 32 degrees. But once the temperature hit 0, it would be okay. Is that true? This story that I heard, Mr. Stern?
Actually, I think Washington did a sort of a heroic job over past years. They had buses, metro buses out when it got, I think, below 15 degrees, and there was a hypothermia in effect under 32 degrees.
When I look upon this, and we talk about something, we're not going to provide help until they're crisis. They threaten to kill someone themselves, or you would talk about people are not even aware of their symptoms. In this case, now they're an imminent threat because they're not even aware of their illnesses. It's sad that we have to go to that extent.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I would say is on the day it got really cold, I went out to the bus, and there were 3 people on the bus. I then went under a bridge nearby, and there was 5 or 6 people there who refused to go on the bus. So there is that.
Thank you. Dr. Evans, as you heard these stories about how much is spent from Judge Leifman talked about this, Sheriff Dart talked about this, Mr. Basadi, all these other folks. If you had that kind of money, could you make a difference? I mean, we're spending it in hospital beds, emergency rooms, we're not getting treatment. We're spending it in jails. We're spending it in courts. Could you keep people out of those systems if Medicaid and other things paid for that kind of funding?
There's no question that we can and we do. For example, in Philadelphia, if you take the issue of homelessness, because we have a mayor that has been pretty interested in this issue, he's been able to convince the Philadelphia Housing Authority to make available Section 8 vouchers to my department, which does homeless outreach. Over the last several years, we've had approximately 200 vouchers a year. And with that, we've been able to get about over 500 people off of the streets of Philadelphia who were formerly homeless, many of whom have serious mental illness and or substance use problems. And the way we were able to do that is to use those housing resources matched with Medicaid-funded behavioral health care services. And to date, we have about 93% of those people who are still in stable housing. So I think that these are solvable issues. I think it takes creative financing, and I think it takes innovations in how we deliver services.
We'll look forward to hearing some specific comments from you and others, too, and what needs to change in some of the definitions of care so that money can be spent in helping people, preventing problems and treating them. I know I'm over, but I got to ask you, Mr. Rahee, because you have Mrs. Ashley at the table here, who has a son who is a good man but dealt with schizophrenia. You have advice for parents and for other people dealing with this?
I believe that Dr. Evans said it best, is that mental illness is treatable, and I think a lot of the panel said mental illness is treatable, but I think we have to have the education to know that it is treatable and that it is something that you can overcome. And I think having FACES as well as these evidence-based practices will do so much. And,
Thank you.
I do think
That's a good message of hope. Ms. DeGette.
Thank you. Let me follow up on that statement, Mr. Rahee, by you and Dr. Evans. Dr. Evans, you talked about how evidence-based practices and lengths of stay can really be used for treatment, and part of the problem is, part of some of these illnesses is people don't realize that they're ill, and part of it is stigma. So my question to you is, from what I understand from what you're saying and others, is that if we can identify someone with severe mental illness early on and get them into that treatment, we actually can stabilize their situation. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct, and the research is pretty clear on this. If you can intervene with people early, particularly after their first episode, and there are evidence-based treatments for people who are experiencing their first episode, you can dramatically change the trajectory of their illness and significantly improve clinical outcomes.
And I would assume you would agree with me that probably the way to do that early identification is not when they present at an emergency room or a jail, correct?
That would be correct.
And I would assume, Dr. Hirschen, you would agree with that from an emergency room perspective as well. That's not the ideal way to identify a severe mental illness and treat it, correct?
No, we take care of emergent and urgent, acute psychiatric problems, but my preference would be not to have to deal with it. I mean, to find support systems, both inpatient and outpatients, that they don't come at 3 o'clock in the morning homeless and cold because they have no other place to go. And
right.
And so yes, I would.
And they have to find a bed. And Mr. Dart, you would agree with that from a penal perspective as well, correct?
Oh, yeah, absolutely, on two fronts. One, frankly, during the cold weather, we have people affirmatively commit offenses so they can come into our housing.
Right.
I talk with the detainees on a regular basis. They will tell me frequently they don't want to leave the jail because it's the best place they can go for treatment. They feel safe. They don't get harmed out in the community. And we've had some where we'll release them. They'll try to break back into the jail as a result of that. And Congresswoman, the one thing that always has troubled me, when you think about it, each and every one of these people, we have a full file on them, not only on their criminal background,
Right.
but their mental health needs. Why we can't follow them out in a simple case management type of fashion. And even if we just break the cycle for a short period of time, we'd save tremendous amounts of money.
You don't know this, Sheriff, but I started my career as a public defender, and so I know this very, very well. I had so many clients in those days who you could just see they were severely mentally ill, and there was nothing we could do with them. Now, I want to ask you again, Dr. Hon, I mean, if we had a better system like one Dr. Evans is talking about to identify and to treat folks at an early stage, then when somebody really did have an acute problem, the emergency system would be better equipped to deal with those folks because theoretically there would be fewer of them, correct?
Well, there would be fewer, but there would also be more structure to support them. So a lot of this is the lack of a kind of systematic structure to support these people who are either coming in because they have acute needs or because of their social circumstances. So the idea to have that improved structure both from a mental as well as social perspective, I think, are very critical.
Yeah, and I want to ask you, Ms. Ashley, as a mom, as a fellow mom here, you would much rather, you as a nurse, you identified that your son had severe psychiatric problems from an early stage, but you didn't have any recourse to get him the kind of treatment he needed except for continually taking him to the emergency room. Is that what I hear you saying?
Yes, that's right. I worked very closely with his primary medical provider who obviously knew there was something wrong with him, but my son would continuously deny going to the emergency room to get psychiatric evaluation. The psychiatric people were even willing to come to his medical appointment to evaluate him. That's how tight our community was, and still my son would say no, he would not go.
Right.
So I actually had to set up a situation where he went to the emergency room to get lab work done
and then
have him received by the psychiatrist and his primary medical provider to put him on a hold.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Evans, just if you can briefly tell me, you've got several projects going on. Where do you get the funding for those projects?
So Philadelphia is unique in that the city manages the behavioral health, all of the public sector behavioral health services that come in. The city is capitated for the entire Medicaid population, so we manage the Medicaid benefit for everyone who has a medical
So you are getting Medicaid benefits?
We are getting Medicaid, but we also receive state, federal, local grant dollars as well.
And I just want to finish up with you, Mr. Rahee. You heard what Ms. Ashley was talking about. Her son was denying what was happening, and she had to sort of trick him. What do you think about people who get diagnosed with these diseases? Is it the stigma? Is it the nature of the disease? And what's your opinion what we can do to get folks into treatment like you were able to do and to accept the disease, very briefly?
So I have to very much recognize that mental illness is individual to each person. There's so many different diagnoses, and each person, even with the same diagnoses, responds differently to the medication, responds differently to the knowledge that they may even have it, or even responds differently to their parents' care and concern. So, I mean, with that, and I do want to acknowledge that I'm voice, but I'm not the only voice, and there's so many people out there. So I just want to acknowledge that to your point, that it's so different, and it's hard. This is hard. You know, this is not easy. So even if you have the care provided, it's still a journey, one, and two, you still have to recognize that everybody's different. So.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Now recognize the Vice Chair of the full committee from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank each of you for taking the time to be here and for your willingness to tell your stories. And I think it's such an important component, and it's important for us to have your insights as we look at the issue. The chairman has been on this since day one and looking for a way to reach parity and to provide some certainty for those that suffer from mental illness. So we appreciate that you are helping us work through this process. Dr. Hon, I want to come to you first. Going back to the American College of Emergency Physicians 2014 state-by-state report card that is out there, and looking at the data relative to 5 years earlier, and you look at the declines in the psychiatric beds across the country, has that been consistent in your rural, suburban, and urban issues? Where are we seeing the greatest attrition in the number of beds? Because one of the things we hear from people, especially in our rural areas, is they have no access and they don't know where to turn.
So I would say that each jurisdiction, each region, each state is different. It's a little hard to say, but as a general rule, access to care in rural settings is much more difficult. And the other thing to recognize is that even if you have insurance, insurance doesn't mean access, because you have to find someone who can take that insurance and who will be there to give you the services. So as a general rule, the rural settings and the areas in which there's fewer services are disproportionately impacted. So I would agree with that.
Okay. How do we fix that? How do we fix that disparity? What do you think? Because the access is so critical. And as you said, you may have access to the queue, but that does not mean you have access to the physician. And what we are seeing with the implementation of Obamacare and the President's health care law, so many people say, well, I've got an insurance card now. And of course, in Tennessee, we saw this with the advent of TennCare back in the 90s. But there was nowhere that they could go for the care, or it may be 180 miles away, which is debilitating when you're trying to access this. So what do you think?
Well, I think, again, that, you know, not just psychiatric care, but many types of care, is you have to look for creative solutions. And one of the solutions for that is regionalization of care. So, for example, if you've got a regional center of excellence for psychiatric care, to be able to utilize that either through telemedicine so they can do evaluations long distance, or in a setting in which they don't have a psychiatric provider there, or there's a way that you can use that regionalization to help improve the care, I think is one potential model. I think we need to do research to look for better ways to be able to provide care, recognizing that our technology and that there's an increased demand, but our ability to perhaps meet that demand can be adjusted.
Okay. Ms. Ashley, I see you shaking your head. You like the idea of using the telemedicine concepts?
Yes, at UC Davis, we already use telemedicine for medical diagnoses and so forth. And so I definitely can see telemedicine with good case management follow-up definitely would be very helpful to the family and the consumer.
So would you classify that primarily as using the telemedicine concepts as an assistance in early intervention, or where would that have the greatest impact?
At the very beginning.
The very beginning, being able to utilize that. I've got just a couple of seconds left. Dr. Geller, deinstitutionalization. And you talked about that in your testimony, and you said it was not initiated as a considered policy, but as an accident of history. I want you to expand on that just a moment.
Sure. If you look at the literature throughout the era, you don't find any literature that talks about deinstitutionalization before it happened. It was labeled retrospectively. Some of the downsizing occurred because of the introduction of psychotropic medications, and some because of advocacy. But the major incentive for deinstitutionalization is the IMD rule. The IMD exclusion means that if I'm in a state hospital, my state pays dollar for dollar for my care. If I'm in the community, my state pays no more than 50 cents on the dollar and may pay as little as 13 cents on the dollar. So that any state has a vested interest in moving people from state hospitals to the community, the cost shift from state tax dollars to federal tax dollars, and I believe that's been the major incentive. It was never a design policy.
So it was done for the money. It was done. I yell back.
Thank you. Now recognize Mr. Butterfield for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for convening this hearing, and thank all of the witnesses for your testimony today. but more importantly, thank you for your passion. I understand what mental health is all about, and I thank you so very much. I missed some of your testimony, but I've been reading as quickly as I could Dr. Ederson's testimony. I have it in my hand, and it's very interesting and it's very correct. You dwell on the Medicaid expansion aspect of health care, and I thank you for raising that because that's critically important. As most of us know, this committee wrote the Affordable Care Act. It was written several years ago, and the Energy and Commerce Committee is the proud author of that legislation. And as part of that legislation, it was our intent to expand the Medicaid provision so that low-income childless adults could receive the benefit of health care. We mandated that the states expand their program. That part of the law was tested in the U.S. Supreme Court, and unfortunately, the court said that we overstepped our authority, and even though it was a proper exercise of legislation, that we could not compel the states to expand their Medicaid program, and that was very disappointing to me. Now 25 states have refused to participate in that expansion, and my state of North Carolina happens to be one of those states. My state turns down nearly $5 million per day, which could help provide care to those with mental health issues. And so I'm appalled, not only appalled at my state, but the other states that have chosen not to expand their Medicaid program because we need it. The Medicaid expansion would not have been a cost to the states, at least for the first 3 years. All of the costs would be borne by the federal government. Following that, the federal government would pay 90% of the cost of care. And so we have low-income individuals all across the country who are suffering from mental health issues, from substance abuse, who are not getting the care that they rightfully deserve. I live in a low-income community. It's an African-American community in North Carolina, and I can tell you that mental health and substance abuse issues are pervasive all across my community. Before coming to Congress 10 years ago, I was a trial judge, not only in my community, but in 32 counties throughout my region. I was one of 10 judges who presided over the most serious cases in 32 counties, and I can tell you that we need to extend a hand of friendship and a safety net for those who are in need. And so I applaud you for lifting up the whole idea of Medicaid expansion. Now I get to the question, Dr. Ederson. I had to get that off my chest because I understand mental health. It's not as much as the 10 of you, but I clearly understand it. I understand the cost of not treating and detecting mental health issues, and I know that we would be a better nation if we just slowed down long enough to recognize the importance of this issue. And while I'm on that, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you. I think Ms. Blackburn was correct. You have lifted this issue up as a priority of yours from day one, and I thank you for it. Dr. Ederson, it is estimated that 189,000 people in my state with mental illness would be eligible for Medicaid if my state would expand Medicaid. How many of the individuals presenting in the emergency rooms with psychiatric and psychological issues would have avoided an emergency room visit if Medicaid had been expanded and they were able to seek treatment before their disease became a crisis?
Well, I cannot give you an exact number. However, what generally happens is if there's not one thing that we know we can go to the emergency department if we're having any kind of crisis. A lot of people do not necessarily have to go to an emergency department because the crisis can be averted in the beginning. And this is where I believe that clinical mental health counselors and marriage and family therapists can come in at. So while I may not know that I have a mental health issue, my friend or my family member may know, and they may be able to convince me or persuade me, hey, why don't you go and talk to this person here, and maybe we can help you out. And for me, that's where the beginning steps are, because once I create the relationship with that patient or client, then they are less likely to go into a crisis scenario and end up in an emergency department.
Thank you. My next question is to you, Mr. Dart, and I heard some of your testimony earlier, and you talked about some people believe that jail is the best place for treatment, and you're absolutely correct. Some in the audience or some watching on television may find that incomprehensible, but that is a fact in real life. When I was a trial judge, people would inappropriately, they didn't know they were being inappropriate, they would call me at home the night before their loved one was to be sentenced. And they knew that the next day the loved one would probably be getting out of jail and returning to the community. And families would literally call me and beg me, and many of them knew me personally. We'd grown up together years ago. They would call and plead with me as a judge not to release their loved one because they could get better care and treatment in the facility as opposed to the community. And they felt that releasing their loved one would be a danger to the inmate and to the community. So thank you for bringing that up and reminding me of those days when I was on the bench. And you've been very kind, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Now recognize the Vice Chair of this subcommittee, Dr. Burgess, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Heem, I just have to say, I don't think it was part of your prepared remarks, but your comments about the individualization of care and the personalization of care, that is, those words are golden, and I hope that everyone on this dais heard those and will consider them. Dr. Geller, thank you for your thoughtful chronicling of the problem. I cannot go back as far as Franklin Pierce, but I did practice medicine in the 80s and 90s. Not psychiatry, but more in the general medicine realm. But I remember during that time the vast expansion of psychiatric facilities that occurred. I'm not sure if I know why that expansion occurred, but then as a result of probably actions by perhaps this subcommittee in April of 1992, a lot of that was curtailed. And in fact, in just researching for this hearing, here's an article from '93 that talked about in the 1 4-year period, the number of psychiatric institutions doubled, and the graphic they have is 1984 to 1988. This was a major scandal in the country. A company known then as National Medical Enterprises eventually entered into some sort of consent decree with the Department of Justice, and many of the private insurers sued the hospital company for overutilization or over-hospitalization of patients. So it seems like we went from there where there was too much activity going on to now where there's not enough. I can't help but feel the emphasis on administrative pricing and not paying attention to the individual care that Mr. Rahim talked about is perhaps responsible. But I think this subcommittee would do well to remember that it was 20 years ago where we were talking about a very different problem. You were probably, I don't want to presuppose, but you were probably in practice at that time. Is that not correct?
Sir.
Do you recall the events that I'm talking about?
Yes, sir.
And what is your observation? I mean, help us here. You were there, a psychiatrist on the ground when this was going on. What, in your opinion, what is it that happened that caused that rapid expansion of psychiatric beds and their overutilization, and then the contraction that followed?
The expansion that you're talking about was largely accounted for by private psychiatric hospitals, generally chain hospitals that saw an opportunity to make money quickly. When managed care began to require pre-authorization and the possibilities for admission became more stringent, those hospitals quickly disappeared. While all that is happening, the public psychiatric hospitals were still shrinking. And if I could take a moment and...
Sure.
What we seem to not be spending time on is that we're talking about psychiatric disorders. And while resources are necessary, build it and they will come does not apply to all the people who have psychiatric disorders. We had a demonstration of that in Western Massachusetts. We had a federal court-ordered consent decree in 1978. Western Massachusetts, the catchment area is larger than 5 of the states in the United States. At that time, Western Massachusetts had more per capita expenditure for mental health services than any state in the United States, and there wasn't another state that came close. and we still had some of the same problems.
Yes, sir.
We have a population, some of whom have something called anosognosia. They don't recognize they have an illness.
Sure.
You need more than just resources.
Let me, Dr. Hirschman, in the few seconds I have left, I mean, you brought up EMTALA, and as a practicing physician, I'm familiar with that. One of the great venerable institutions in my neck of the woods, Parkland Hospital, got into a great deal of difficulty with their psychiatric emergency room not too terribly long ago, and in fact put the whole institution at risk because of some federal regulations that they ran afoul of. But eventually they went to outsourcing their psychiatric emergency room to a private hospital facility. Have you had, in your experience, does this seem like are more hospitals going to be doing this?
My sense is that it's more complicated than simply a single answer. You have to look at it from both the patient's perspective as well as the provider's perspective, and coming up with solutions that allow you to meet the patient's needs. If it's outsourced in one institution, in one jurisdiction, that might work. But again, I think that recognizing that there's a limited number of resources, looking for ways to more efficiently and effectively utilize those resources will be key.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Yieldback. Mr. Tomko, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I appreciate your continued use of this subcommittee to shed light on the issues related to mental health. For far too long now, mental health issues have been swept away in the shadows. So anything we can do to raise the profile and reduce the stigma associated with mental illnesses is a very worthy endeavor indeed. As amply demonstrated today, the lack of available psychiatric beds, particularly in times of crises, can be a pressing issue. For example, we all witnessed the tragedy that occurred in neighboring Virginia when State Senator Craig Deeds was unable to locate an available bed for his son in time. However, we also all share a goal of de-escalating and treating these types of situations before they do reach the stage where a patient requires hospital-based care. So with that in mind, Dr. Evans, from your experience, how can we improve our mental health delivery system in a way that reduces the demand factor for inpatient psychiatric care?
Okay. Thank you for that question. I think that any discussion about psychiatric bed capacity focuses on expanding bed capacity, and I think that's a trap. Prior to being in Philadelphia, I was also the deputy commissioner in the state of Connecticut. So the past 15 years, I've been in administrative positions that have to make decisions about how resources are deployed in a mental health system. And I can tell you that the fundamental issue is that we have to build a very strong community-based system. That is the fundamental problem. Psychiatric bed capacity is only a symptom of a deeper problem. And I think you hear the testimony of all the people here. They talk about the difficulty when it's clear that a family member or even a person is having a problem. Well, there are not the resources to do the kind of outreach to individuals when they're in at that point. And the way we financed our service system, we have to wait until people are at a crisis point. And that's not only the problem of the mental health systems, but it really has to do with the fact that unless we create the kind of flexibility where mental health systems can do the kind of assertive outreach, we're going to continue to have this problem. As I remember, maybe it was Dr. Geller that said, one of the problems with mental illness is that often people don't recognize that they have a problem. And if people don't recognize that they have a problem, you can build as many beds as you want. People are not going to get there unless they're forced into those beds. The solution is to have resources in the community where people can, and for example, in Philadelphia, we have mobile crisis teams that can go out and reach out to people before they're hospitalized. Those kinds of services, I think, are critical.
Thank you. And so as you build that infrastructure and that holistic response, Dr. Evans, what is the appropriate way to measure the amount of inpatient beds that would be required in a given community?
I think that that's a very difficult question to answer, and people have used things like population and so forth. The reality is that it depends on how your service system is structured. If you have a service system that has resources on the front end, for example, in Philadelphia we have a network of 5 crisis response centers. So we don't have the problem of people going to emergency departments and who are in psychiatric crisis, not to the extent that you have in other cities. We have a mobile crisis team that can do outreach. And so in Philadelphia, that might look different than another system that might be similarly resourced in terms of the amount of money, but doesn't have those kinds of services. I think the issue is we have to build a very strong community-based system that prevents people from going into crisis, and we have to have the services so that when people come out of those beds, that we're able to help them in their process of recovery, we're able to help them to stabilize, and we're able to do things like helping people get supported employment, or to use supported employment, for example, which dramatically decreases hospitalization. So those kinds of community-based services are really important in terms of the capacity that you need.
Thank you. And Dr. Geller, in your testimony, you rely heavily on the fact that state investments in mental health have been predicated upon where they can shift the most of the cost to the federal government. In your opinion, how could we address the Medicaid IMD exclusion without leading to a disinvestment by our states of mental health services?
That's an excellent question. In my testimony, I mentioned that federal government should offer the IMD exclusion waivers to states requiring a maintenance of effort. The American Psychiatric Association has a position statement that is rather specific on this. I could certainly provide it to you, that indicates that a state who took such a waiver would be required to continue its expenditure as averaged over the past 5 years from all sources that they spent previously. That is not just the Department of Mental Health, but the Department of Children's Services, Department of Corrections, and so on and so forth. If there was a requirement for maintenance of effort, there couldn't be a reverse shift.
Thank you. I agree with that maintenance of efforts. So thank you very much. And again, to the entire panel, your testimony is very much appreciated.
Thank you. Now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, Dr. Geller, if you could provide that information to me as well that you were just talking about.
Yes, sir.
Very interesting. I found your testimony and everybody's testimony very informative. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you having these hearings. I have to say that I don't understand mental illness. It worries me because I don't. And it's one of those areas where I least like these hearings that the chairman has called, because normally I have a pretty good idea of where I think we ought to go when it comes to these mental health issues. I have to confess that I'm learning every time we have a hearing something, but I'm also concerned that I don't think that we have all the answers, or that we even have any idea of what all the answers are. So I appreciate you all helping us try to figure that out as representatives of the people. It is interesting because we're all trying, I think, Democrats and Republicans on this subcommittee are trying to figure out what we can do to make the situation better. I don't, however, believe that in the short term we're going to be able to make huge differences because we're going to have to do some trial and error. We're going to have to try to do some new things and some different things, and I appreciate that. In that regard, I guess I'll look to Mr. Dart and to Judge Leifman. How can we make the court system better? We're not going to overnight say, okay, none of the folks with mental illnesses are going to come into the court systems. But what can we do to make the court system better? You've heard from Ms. DeGette, who has a public defender background, and Judge, now Congressman Butterfield. I was a criminal defense attorney for 27 years, and I have to commend one of my judges back home. Hasn't set up a mental health court, but has a mental health docket where she deals with folks who have those issues and tries to identify those in advance so that they can have the experts present to help on that. But what types of things can we do to encourage the states and the federal system to do a better job? Until we fix it, what can we do to help out in the court systems?
Thank you, Congressman. I'll be quick because Judge Leifman and I have talked before about these things. Getting the courts more engaged is imperative. In our court system, they have been completely disengaged. Whenever you ask them about solutions, they say, well, we have a mental health court, so it's done. Their mental health court usually handles about 150 cases total a year. I usually have about 3,500 mentally ill in my jail on a day. So we can't be diverted when people have programs that are inherently good but aren't getting at the heart of the problem. What we've been doing internally is trying to identify people literally as they're dropped off from being arrested the night before, downloading quickly their information on their mental illness, and then we put a file together for the public defender. I'm a former state's attorney. We put a file together for the public defender to plead with the judge that this person is not necessarily a criminal, put them in an alternative setting, such as a nursing home setting. And we've been doing that at my jail, where I put electronic bracelets on their legs. I monitor them at this setting. The results are fantastic, as you can imagine, compared to what the other treatment would be, which is I put them in a 4x8 cell with a complete stranger with their own issues as well. So we've been doing that, and then on the back end, we've been pretty much winging it, and that's why, Congressman, when you talk about trial and error, that really is the route that we've been going. It can't get any worse than it is now, so let's try some new things. So on the back end, what we've been doing is we ourselves have been putting together case plans to them. We drive them to locations where we potentially can get housing for them so they can be there and be stabilized, and then we run a 24-hour hotline to try to, when they're in crisis, to get out to them to help them. But it's just what you said, Congressman. We're trial and error stage right now, but there are things such as that certain judicial circuits could be doing. Others are better. Ours is a real struggle.
Judge. Thank you for your question. We've created an organization called the Judges Leadership Initiative with a parallel organization called the Psychiatric Leadership Group, and we're working with the American Psychiatric Foundation. And what we're doing now is we have about 400 judges involved in this operation, and we're going around the country. We have developed a curriculum to teach judges how to identify people in court who may have a serious mental illness, how to de-escalate a situation in court so they don't make it worse, but more importantly, how to work in the community to set up the kind of supports you need to be able to divert this population. And so what we recommend are a couple things. A pre-arrest type diversion where you work with law enforcement to teach them a program called Crisis Intervention Team Policing, where the police are actually taught how to de-escalate, where to transport, and how to avoid an arrest. Our statistics are phenomenal. As I mentioned, we've closed the jail as a result of our CIT officers in Dade County. We've also taught them to set up post-arrest diversion programs so that you take low-level offenses that don't need to be in jail or felonies that are nonviolent, and you make sure that they get access to treatment. Sheriff Dart is correct. A mental health court only handles a fraction of the case, and bless you, and the data is such that unless they're taking the right people, they actually can do more harm than good. So you have to be very careful and you have to be educated.
And Mr. Chairman, I know I'm out of time, but could we give Chief Basadi, I know I mispronounced that, apologize. But could we give the Chief a moment to comment on that as well?
Yes. Well, I would say our main concern, law enforcement-wise, are the seriously mentally ill group that are unaware of their illness. I mean, that's where it lies, wherein the problem lies for us. The police departments, your county directors know who these certain group of people are because we deal with them every day, and there's answers that we can deal with that. In a case that we had not long ago, we had a woman severely mentally ill, went into a house. No one was home, took the pit bull and put it in a closet, went upstairs, took all the clothing out of the woman's clothes, put her dishes from upstairs, downstairs, moved all the pictures, spent the day. The woman came home, the homeowner, and walked in on her, and of course, had a cow right then and there, called the police come, and she was totally out of her mind, psychotic, carrying on. So when I arrived at the police station on a different matter, I heard this screaming coming from our booking area. She was in the booking area, voices were telling her, and she was complaining she was being raped by whatever at the time while she's sitting there. So I made a decision at that point, which a lot of people don't do, but being familiar with this topic, I said, listen, we're not arresting her for burglary. I said, we need to, she's going to go to the psych unit, but I'm going to send a letter with her saying that she is obviously dangerous. She could have been killed. Whoever came home could have shot and killed her, most likely to happen. I said, if we arrest her, she's going to go to the county jail. She's going to be a major problem for them. From there, our officers are going to go out to grand jury where they're going to move to indict her for whatever. She'll be in jail for a year before they decide that she's so mentally ill that she can't stand trial, and then she'll be back here again. I said, so let's get her into the system now and put her through that service. But I accompanied that with a letter to our county mental health director saying, I strongly suggest that, she is proven to be dangerous. She has a long history, to herself mostly. I suggest that you enter her into the assisted outpatient treatment program. This program, then, they provide the services to her through this program. She has not been a problem since. They monitor to make sure that she's in some kind of treatment, and as long as she's in treatment, she's not a problem. However, if we went the legal system as we normally would do, we would be dealing with her every few weeks because she has anosognosia, she does not believe she's ill, and I know, stigmatism is a big concern, and my wife and I both pray for the day that our daughter has the insight that Mr. Rahim has into her illness, because I believe if she had that insight, she could seek what everybody's talking about, care in the community. It's been 20 years almost, and she does not have that insight. She has voices, and they are, as she's concerned, the supreme being.
I hate to cut you off, but my time is way over.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
But you get going.
No, I appreciate the testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
That was valuable because New York, as I understand, has actually reduced their incarceration rates and homeless rates, I think, by 70%. It's been a massive savings.
That's correct, through AOT.
Through AOT, thank you. Ms. Kowski, you recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, I'm so glad I got here because I wanted to say a special welcome to my great friend, Sheriff Tom Dart. We were seatmates for a while in the Illinois General Assembly, and I wanted to really talk to you about a problem I know you're struggling with so much. The New York Times article inside a mental hospital called Jail really focused on the largest mental health center in America. Is a huge compound here in Chicago with thousands of people suffering from mania, psychosis, other disorders, all surrounded by high fences and barbed wire. That's the county jail. So I wish you would just briefly discuss how cuts to mental health programs and services have affected individuals with mental illness that are now in your custody.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman, and it's great seeing you again. You almost don't know where to start, because up until about 5 years ago, the normal process in our jail 5-6 years ago, and frankly, from my understanding, in most jails around the country now, is when you get that court order to release somebody, you release them. That the court is ordering you to release them, you got to let them go. So you let them go. What we were seeing is out in front of our jail, there were people that just wandered around, stayed there, and as I mentioned earlier, we've had people trying to break back in, one through a planter through a window to crawl back into the jail, and then we had to arrest him. The reality of it is that when we were releasing people, they had nowhere to go. And in the face of that, in our state, we have made tremendous cuts. I mean, just over the last 10 years, we are one of the leading states in cutting mental health funding, period. And in the city of Chicago, we just cut in half our clinics in the community. So when the people leave, not only they had nowhere to go, there was no plan whatsoever. And as I had referenced earlier, I do think this is doable with not great expenditures, because we literally have everything about this person in our possession. So if you're trying to think of case plans and diagnosing them and what would be the best strategies, there's a myriad of things we can do. But when you have no place for them to go, I used to hand out a resource book in my first couple of years as sheriff to give people a place to go. I had to stop doing that because everything in it was wrong, because most of the things that we were trying to steer people toward were all closing. And so we were then setting them up to fail because there was nothing really out there. And so the cuts are so tremendous, it's left all the locals, including ourselves, trying to devise unique, creative strategies on what to do, including, as I say, I will drive people now. If I can find homes for them where they're leaving, we'll drive them there. I'll contact their family members ahead of time to get them to come pick people up. And mind you, we are happy to do this, but I don't think under anyone's estimation sheriffs should be doing this. We're supposed to lock people up, and that's really sort of built to the end of it. But there is nothing else out there. And in our county in particular, it has really been bad, and it's desperate, and it's really heartbreaking. I talk with the detainees frequently, and yeah, do we have bad people in the jail who have committed horrible offenses or are mentally ill? Yeah, we have those. The vast majority of them, though, are good people who are suffering from mental illness, and the reason they're there is because of the mental illness. It's not because they're a criminal. And yet we treat them like criminals, they're housed with criminals, and then when we leave them, we basically pat them on the back and say, good luck, and we'll see you soon, and then we're all puzzled they're back with me.
So it's not just a matter then of driving them to a place, it's that at the end of the day there's no place for many of them, right?
There's no place for them, and there's no one to work with them, because they need a certain level of case managing to make sure they stay on their meds, that when they do go into crisis, they're not left to doing what is going on right now, which is they call myself and my staff, and we try to figure out what we can help them with. There are things that we can do that will not be expensive that can help, and it can be a continuum of care. It could work with people. It won't be 100% successful, but it can't conceivably be any worse than what we do now.
And what are those simple things?
Oh, if upon leaving the jail, if I had someone from a county agency, state agency, that would literally be their case manager, who would just literally work with them through housing issues, staying on their meds, so that they then don't start self-medicating, which is no surprise that we're having this heroin epidemic in our county, because it's the next best thing to their meds is the heroin, and it's so cheap these days. They stay on their meds. Housing, there is some housing available. It's not the best, but it's not that expensive. I was paying for housing out of my own budget, but I've run out of money now. And so, Judge Leifman said, if we had a continuum working with the medical side, but also with the judiciary, we could have something that could be somewhat of a model for a lot of people and not that expensive.
Thank you very much, and thanks for what you're doing. Good to see you.
Thank you so much. It's great seeing you.
I just want to follow up, Sheriff Dart. You heard Chief Basadi talk about New York has assisted outpatient treatment where they make sure, as long as that person has been shown to be a safety risk or they've had an episode of violence or jail time before, they could work with a judge and they work on an agreement to stay on their medication and get in treatment. Now, I understand you don't have that in Cook County. Am I correct?
No, and we just had some intervention just literally days ago from our state Supreme Court to try to rearrange and help our local judiciary in doing their job. But we have not had engagement from our judiciary. I'll be honest with you, you need an enlightened judiciary who clearly understands the distinction between criminal law and mental illness and know that there's other paths to go, because otherwise you're left with, frankly, Mr. Chairman, isolated judges who get it, who will run certain courts and, frankly, take risks. We, for years now, as I say, have been putting all these files together to hand to the public defender to just show the mental health background here, the lack of criminality, and yet they go up and they might as well be talking in a foreign language to the judge. The judge does the same thing. They throw them in the jail, and we continue to do the same work. So a enlightened judiciary that's engaged with it, and it does happen in other jurisdictions, would it be absolutely remarkable and save money?
Get Judge Leifman up there.
Yeah. Oh, you don't know what I wouldn't do to get him.
Thank you. Ms. Elmers, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, thank you to the panel. This is one of those situations where I have questions for every one of you, but unfortunately, we don't have enough time for that. So I'll try to stay focused. And to the point of how we can, as legislators, help this issue. And try to focus on those areas where we think there is the greatest need, at least to get it started, because Mr. Dart, as you have pointed out, we're in a pretty bad place right now, so anything we do is going to improve the situation. And I am very concerned about those who are being released from jail and not able to continue their treatment, because as you've pointed out, it is just cyclic, and Mr. Basadi as well. Ms. Ashley, I do want to go back to one of the issues that's been raised, and I know we're discussing coverage, medical coverage, how, I know some of my colleagues are saying if we just had a bigger Medicaid system that might actually help the situation. That obviously, we're dealing with that every day here, trying to make our health care coverage system work better. If I remember correctly from your testimony and previous questions, you said you have private insurance that your son was able to receive treatment under. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. I have him as a disabled adult under my insurance.
Okay, so you actually had insurance coverage, but still had the difficulties. It wasn't just an issue of, here's my insurance card, therefore I'm going to get mental health services for my son.
Right. In fact, he is denied some services in the community because he does have private insurance.
I see. Okay.
Even though he has SSI and Medi-Cal, they have no way to bill the insurance to get it denied and then go on Medi-Cal. So I don't even have access to a lot of the support services that are available in my community because he's on private insurance. And people have even told me to take him off private insurance.
Okay, see that's obviously...
And really having private insurance is what gets him hospitalized quickly, because the lights go off when they see that I have private insurance versus Medi-Cal or Medicaid.
I see. Now, to that point, one of the things that I was wondering when you were describing your situation in the emergency room, and I've seen this in so many hospitals where they've literally brought me to the designated area in the emergency room that they have literally put together because of this situation so that they can give the best treatment possible, but they're still hampered because they're obviously not a psychiatric unit, and they're dealing with the situation. Was he able to at least start receiving mental health treatment while he was there in the emergency room? Or, I mean, was that pretty much at a standstill until he received the psychiatric bed?
Right, he was put in 4-point restraints and heavily sedated until they transferred him to the hospital.
So there, okay, so there, yeah, and you did mention that. So I thank you for that. And again, that's an area we were trying to fix. We're all, you know, there are so many pieces and parts to this issue. Mr. Basadi, you had, one of the things that I would like to clarify, even just for committee, is the difference between civil commitment and forensic commitment, if you can answer that question, because I think that will help us as well, because I think sometimes we do find ourselves, again, struggling with the situation of those who do not acknowledge that they have a problem, and yet they are having a psychotic episode.
And that is, you know, that's where the problem lies. The police will bring the person from their home or from wherever the instance occurs to the emergency room, usually against their will, under a state code for imminent dangerousness, and then they're relying on the interview at the hospital for the psychiatrist to make a determination that they meet the standards to hold for a 72-hour period for evaluation for commitment under that standard. So I think Dr. Geller could probably help me with the difference between the civil. I'm more familiar with how we would do it.
Dr. Geller, would you like to expand on that then?
Sure. Every state has its Mental Health Act, and that allows people to be civilly committed, usually on a standard of dangerous to self, dangerous to others, or gravely in need of care, and there's no crime involved. A forensic commitment would mean that a person has been charged and booked, and then they're going to be committed usually initially for determination of competency to stand trial, criminal responsibility, or both, that you heard about earlier. If they cannot stand trial or are found not guilty by reason of insanity, then they can be further committed under a criminal statute of that state.
Okay. And yes, Dr. Hershen?
I think it may be state by state, but in my state what happens is there's a fixed number of inpatient beds. And these individuals who are on forensic, not the ones who have been convicted, but they're often the pretrial folks, will be taking up the beds that I'll be looking for, you know, from the emergency department. So it doubly impacts it because it then backs up my system because the forensic folks are being housed in that situation.
And if I could add from the law enforcement aspect, most of the people that we're talking about, we're bringing in not because of crimes. We're bringing in because of just bizarre activity or dangerousness. The criminal aspect, we would have to make an arrest, and it would go through the jail system, and they would arrange for psychiatric evaluation.
And Judge Leifman, I think you look like you wanted to indicate, and I realize I've gone over my time, but I would love to hear
what's happening is the forensic beds are actually taking over the civil beds.
I see.
Because ours is constitutional. Because if you're arrested on a felony generally and you're incompetent to stand trial, you have to go for competency restoration. So as the states don't want to expand those budgets, they just start to use the civil beds for forensic beds.
To make up
so it's really creating this horrible pressure.
I see. Well, thank you all. And Mr. Rahim, too, and Ms. Ashley, for your personal stories. So important for us to hear because we need to understand how we can deal with this situation better. And again, thank you to all of you. This has been a very, very good subcommittee hearing, and I'm hoping that we will really be able to fix this problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Elmers. Now recognize Mr. Harper for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank each of you for being here and helping us. We hope in the process we'll be able to look at some suggestions and directions, some things that may help you. And Chief Basadi, if I could ask you, you know, you've described obviously law enforcement as being the front line on counteracting the impacts of serious mental illness in the community. What kind of burden is this on your resources and your department?
Well, that's the problem. That's where that's what my paper focused on, and it was that most police agencies are are very small in this country. The big cities are the anomalies. So, for instance, in my department, which is considered mid-size with a staff of authorized staff of 50 officers, we will have 3 or 4 cars per shift, a minimum of 3 on the road per shift. So normally when we deal with a severely mentally ill person who is acting violent, it requires at least 2 of our officers. So that's 2 out of 3 people available. Now we have 1 officer for a municipality, a good-sized municipality, until those officers are free. A lot of times the ambulance can't take them because they're too combative, and the hospital wants you to stay with them while they're in the emergency room until they make a determination as they're staying, which is because if they decide they're not staying, they don't want this psychotic person in their lobby, and you need to take them back to where you came from. So it is a great depletion of resources for law enforcement nationwide, especially those in the rural areas.
You know, I actually was a city prosecutor for about 6 years before I came here, and that was always the thing. And I appreciate what you said you do, because sometimes you know they don't need to be incarcerated; they need to get help, and being able, because not every department does it that way. So I want to commend you for that.
Well, it's difficult because you also have a crime victim that doesn't understand why the person that broke into their house is not going to jail.
Right.
So you have to have cooperation on a lot of levels. But also to that end, what I wanted to bring out quick is I got to work with Governor Cuomo's office on the SAFE Act, the back end, Kendra's Law. And one thing that I think we're hopeful is going to make a change is one of the changes in Kendra's Law mandates that in prison settings, those who are receiving psychiatric care in the prison will be evaluated upon release for inclusion into an assisted outpatient treatment program, which hadn't happened before. Before that, your time is up and you're out the door, and there goes your treatment. So we're hoping that that's going to make changes and lessen recidivism.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dr. Evans, I was looking at your title as we were going here, and I'm also, you know, seeing what Miss Ashley's gone through on a personal level and what you have too, Chief. I have a 24-year-old son with Fragile X syndrome. So, you know, he has intellectual disabilities. So, you know, and how do you distinguish between, you know, classic mental illnesses or someone with an intellectual disability that someone who's not trained may not recognize? So give us some wisdom or advice. How do you handle that?
Sure. So the easy way to make the distinction is that if a person has an intellectual disability, that is pretty much permanent. Those kinds of disabilities are lifelong, and our goal there is not necessarily recovery, but it's really to help people to have a high quality of life, to have self-determination. Mental illnesses are treatable, and one can have a very severe mental illness, schizophrenia, for example, bipolar illness, and can recover and can do well. It doesn't happen all of the time, but the majority of the time. And so that's really the distinction. And so we work with people differently based on that.
You know, with my son, if he were out by himself, if he was, you know, maybe in a sensory overload moment, it might be misinterpreted as to what he has. So training and understanding and realizing that every case, every person's different, I know is an important thing for you. I know.
It is, and I think that educating the community about mental illnesses and intellectual disabilities, I think is a real important part of this, because I mean, you've heard the impact that stigma has on people reaching out for help, on the shame that comes with that. And I think that our strategies have to not only include how do we change the service system, but like we've done with other illnesses like cancer, where 30, 40 years ago people used to whisper that, and now people have marches about that and walks about that. And I think it's changed how people reach out for help when they need it. It's changed how we funded research and treatment. And I think the same thing applies to mental illness and behavioral health conditions.
Thank you, Dr. Evans, and thanks to each of you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I do ask that Dr. Burns has asked, we have 2 items here from the New York Times and from Freedom Magazine regarding some cases from 1992, 93 that he'd like to have submitted into the record, so without objection. And Ms. DeGette, you have a clarifying question?
I just have a clarifying comment, Mr. Chairman, and I just want to say again, I've been on this subcommittee for 18 years, and this is, I think, maybe the best panel we've ever had. So thank you all for coming. You had practical solutions. You had different different takes on the mental health system, and I hope that each of you will be willing to make yourselves a resource to the chairman and myself as we move forward in our efforts. Chief, you referred to Kendra's Law, and I just wanted to put in the record what that is, so you can correct me if I'm wrong. I understand what this is. It's a law that was passed in New York that establishes more structured treatment combined with resources across the mental health system, and it's designed to get treatment to folks earlier on without having them participate in the penal system like Sheriff Dart was talking about, or in the emergency room system. It's designed to get them treatment, but of course you have to have an investment to do that of resources. The chairman and I were up here talking about this, and if you did have this investment of resources and you were really able to implement things like this, it would actually probably save money because you wouldn't be putting these people in incarceration or in very expensive ER situations. Every single person here is nodding their head. I'd like to just say that for the record. And thank you very much.
If I could say, the shame of it is we have 45 states that have the very similar law, but very few use it.
Because they're probably not putting the resources into it, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, thank you. And we're gonna try to work on to see what the federal partnership that we can have with all 50 states to help this along. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And Chief, along those lines, I understand, for example, California has the law in the books, but only Nevada County. Only one county uses it.
Yeah, in California, it's optional by county, and only one county, correct.
Well, let me say this. I also agree. Deep thanks. Oh, Dr. Burgess wants a brief comment.
Yeah, just as a brief follow-up, and Dr. Evans, in your testimony, you talk about the introduction of peer specialists. This has come up before in briefings that we've had. This strikes me as likely one of the most cost-effective ways to get rational treatment decisions and to keep people in their treatment. So I do hope you'll share with the committee your experience with that. We are constrained under budgetary rules. We can never score a savings from something that will actually save money. It always scores as a cost, but perhaps this is one of those areas where spending the money wisely would in fact be a good investment. So I thank you for bringing that to our committee today.
Could I just mention?
Sure. Real quick.
Yes. Yeah, I think that there are data that support that peer services are cost effective. I think it's probably the most important thing that we've done in our service system. It not only gives people hope, but one of the real challenges is keeping people engaged in treatment, and we've found nothing that is more effective than a person who's gone through the experience, connecting with another individual, and keeping that person connected, giving that person hope, frankly. It makes a huge difference. And we have one program where we've instituted peers. We reduced our crisis visits by 1/3, and half of those visits would have resulted in an inpatient stay. So we've saved millions of dollars, we believe, by implementing peer services.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Haim, you want to comment on that?
Again, thank you so much for giving patients voice. And I think a couple of words, I know Mr. Dart talked about enlightenment, but I think enlightenment means compassion, dignity, and education. So I think each of us has an ability to be compassionate in our roles, and we have an ability to treat each patient as an individual and with dignity. And I think through contact with people who are doing well, and then that follow-up education as a foundation and groundwork, we can do so much good. So I do thank you again. Thank you.
And again, my thanks to this whole panel. Just a couple of suggestions. While you're in town, I hope you stop in on your member of Congress and say it's important to do some mental health reforms. I'm committed to do this. I know Representative DeGette is too. And the Energy and Commerce Committee will be where some things happen. It's been since 1963, as you referenced, Dr. Geller, the last time this country really did some major mental health reforms in this country. It's long overdue. I know you're all passionate about this, but I hope you energize your own members of Congress as well to help them understand the importance of moving forward on this. Even though you spoke for 5 minutes and you added a few minutes to other things, oftentimes people go through life and wonder if their voice makes a difference. It does. Yours does, and it will continue to echo throughout the House of Representatives in this nation. So I thank you a great deal for all that, and recognize that Mr. Rahim, I think, and others have used the word hope. Where there's no help, there is no hope, and we will make sure we continue to work on that help. So in conclusion, again, thank you to all the witnesses and members that participated in today's hearing. I remind members they have 10 business days to submit questions to the record, and I ask that all witnesses agree to respond promptly to the questions. Thanks so much. God bless.